minority is the rich.
Yeah.
I think that's an excellent slogan.
It's a great slogan because it points it at the real...
It points it at the real enemies.
Yeah.
That, listen, the real enemy, the real reason our lives are shit, not because of the refugees.
Yeah.
It's not because of migrant workers. It's because of Bay Street.
Yeah.
It's because of Ottawa.
Yeah.
And it points the finger at the real enemy. I think any slogan that achieves that, this is a positive slogan.
Like the class slogan.
It's a class slogan, which is, listen, you're right to feel this way. But what's actually causing this problem?
Yeah.
Why are grocery bills so high? Why is rent so high?
Yeah.
You know, why is the city falling apart? It's not because of immigrants. It's because of the rich and powerful, you know, the Galen Westons, the Thompsons, the Rogers family. These are the people who are ruining our lives, not the immigrants. And
most Trump voters don't want a culture war. They're not clamoring for ICE raids. They want better jobs, better working conditions. And that's why we don't fear MAGA. We don't fear right populism. We don't accept the culture war framing of it that says MAGA is the enemy. We don't accept the liberal alarmist attitude that says this is the beginning of a dictatorship. We explain we live under bourgeois democracy. This is a dictatorship of the rich already. The ruling class is the enemy. The capitalists, the bankers, the billionaires are the enemy. Their political parties, their institutions, their media are the enemy. And this is another element that separates us, the Revolutionary Communist International, from the prevalent outlook on the left, which treats this global phenomenon of right populism as a rightward shift in society. If you adjust for inflation during the post-war boom, the median income of a 25-year-old with a high school diploma was making $10,000 more than what a 25-year-old is making on average in the US today. Not only that, they were getting ready to buy a house on average. The average home buyer was in their 20s. Again, inflation adjusted dollars, the median home value was $47,000. Young people aren't talking about buying homes today. They have no prospects for this. What the point is that over the last 50 years, the ruling class has squeezed this out of the hands of the working class. That has been taken from the proletariat into the pockets of the bourgeoisie. This is the class struggle over 50 years that's led to this. Meanwhile, the housing crisis has led to a spike in homelessness. We have the highest homelessness level in the US since World War II. Last year, at some point over the year, 1.5 million people had to sleep on the streets or in a shelter. At the height of the Great Depression, that reached 2 million. We're not that far off, comrades, from that level of misery. You don't need to be a Marxist to point out society is on the wrong track. Everyone can feel that. But you need to be a Marxist in order to explain what is the mechanism behind this. At the root, why exactly is capitalism in decline? And what does this mean? In this world of pessimistic doom, of sense of decline, Marxist perspectives alone provide revolutionary optimism, not because of mysticism or idealism or hopeful thinking. It's because of the materialist conception of history. We have optimism because we understand the process that is unfolding concretely beneath the events. We understand where this is going. It's not the beginning of a dictatorship, it's a distraction. It's not fascism, it's a farce. He is not getting stronger, Trump is getting weaker, and Trump's base is abandoning him. On every single issue, his policies are backfiring. He's getting negative approval ratings. After all the shock and awe of the ICE raids, his handling of immigration is underwater by 8 points. After all this promise of the golden age of economic prosperity, his rating for jobs in the economy has been negative 22 points. Probably the most important factor is inflation. That's received the lowest approval rating of any issue, negative 34 points. So he sends in the troops to distract and to intimidate, and yet the locals in DC, they call them the National Gardeners, because they're deployed on beautification missions to pick up trash and to plant flowers. Now the Democrats, they're rubbing their hands together with every move that Trump makes because they're hoping that this is going to help them in the midterms. But do they have any intention of fighting for the American working class? They have no intention of changing anything. They're playing the same game. Last week, the world has seen class politics come back to life. This is international class solidarity, a mass political general strike against imperialism. When is the last time we saw anything like this? Certainly it's been generations. And it's worth taking a moment to consider the scale of these remarkable events. You had 2 million people last Friday across 100 cities in Italy. Every major city and even small cities had massive demonstrations. And it's not just protests and marches. You have hundreds of thousands of people in the street, but it's the working class moving and seizing control of the means of production. Essentially, they're talking about blocking every harbor in Italy and the dock workers deciding what ships come, what ships get to dock, what ships don't. They're making the decisions.
Insieme al nostro sindacato, USB, insieme a tutti i lavoratori portuali che ci stanno, insieme a tutta la città di Genova, da questa regione escono 13-14 mila container all'anno per Israele. Non esce più un chiodo. Lanceremo lo sciopero internazionale. Bloccheremo le strade, bloccheremo le scuole, bloccheremo tutto.
There's an element of workers' control. You had the largest demonstration in Rome in 50 years. The trade union leaders estimated that it was up to 1 million people just in Rome alone. 150,000 in Milan, 150,000 in Bologna and Florence each. Demonstrations that were stretching 2.5 miles long as the procession's coming down the street. You can't even see the end of it. 80,000 people in Naples. The largest demonstration they're saying in a lot of these cities in 25, 30 years. They blocked the roads, all the major highways, railways, of course the harbors, airlines, oil refineries, and you had participation in Italian industry, the factories, of between 60 and 80%. So these streets are not just filled with random activists or students or demonstrators. All of the youth were out there as well. But you have metal workers and auto workers and teachers and firefighters and healthcare workers and airline workers organizing as workers. There's construction sites and the construction workers are waving to the procession going by and giving fists of solidarity, joining the procession. You had one sign in the street that said, "We wanted to liberate Palestine, and now Palestine is liberating us." Because the Italian working class for a long time has felt this growing discontent and has not found an outlet for that discontent. And now the struggle of Palestine is becoming the focal point. It's becoming the lightning rod that gives an expression to all of this. They're learning also from the movement in France. We've had several national strikes in France. Building on this movement, block everything. Bloquons tout. They've brought down the 5th prime minister that France has had in the last 2 years. Le Cornu, the last prime minister, he lasted for less than 14 hours. It was like 835 minutes. And luckily Macron has appointed the 6th one yesterday. But someone, Comrade, pointed out the French ruling class is literally out of ideas. They reappointed Le Cornu. So he's gonna come back and give it another try. See if the French working class accepts it this time. They've been saying block everything, but how many times have we seen demonstrations that say shut it down? And people shout that into a megaphone, but what are they shutting down? And we've been pointing out, if you really want to shut it down, this is possible. But it's not going to happen by marching from point A to point B. And it's not going to happen just by shouting slogans in the streets. It needs to be a movement of the working class. And for a long time, people didn't understand what that could look like. Now they have a crystal clear image in front of them. This changes. This is the beginning of a new epoch of the class struggle in Italy, in Europe. This struggle is not going away. At the same time that the Italian working class was moving, you had 2 million people in Spain. 500,000 in Madrid alone, 300,000 in Barcelona. The Spanish working class is stirred by this. The youth are moving. 82% of the Spanish population recognizes Israel's actions in Gaza as a genocide. This is the shift of public opinion dramatically on a global scale. Netherlands, in Amsterdam, that's a city of, within city limits, you have less than 1 million people. You had 250,000 demonstrating in Amsterdam. The drone footage, they call this the red line. If you look at the image, it gives you goosebumps. 250,000 people all wearing red as well. A massive, massive demonstration. And it's not just in a couple of these cities. Hundreds of thousands more in Ireland, Austria, Germany, Belgium, Denmark, Bulgaria, Finland, Poland, Portugal, Switzerland, Romania, Greece, Turkey, Morocco, Tunisia, Malaysia, Indonesia. I'm not talking about the last couple years or the last month. I'm talking about last Friday. A massive, massive demonstration in response. I mean, the tipping point was the IDF's attack on the global Sumud Gaza Solidarity Flotilla that was trying to break Israel's blockade and deliver humanitarian aid. I think you all know that the IDF seized the boats and arrested 450 activists from 44 countries, brutalized these activists. They denied them food and water. You know, Greta Thunberg and a lot of other public figures were on these, and the IDF soldiers they forced Greta Thunberg to kiss an Israeli flag, and they wrapped her up in it and marched her around to parade her. What force acts like this? A force that is used to acting with impunity. A force that's used to doing whatever it wants, with no force out there to say, you can't cross this line. But the workers of the world are seeing this. The workers of the world are drawing the line now. World sentiment has turned against the Zionist state. Anti-imperialism is coming forward. This disgust at genocidal crimes. Israel has become isolated on the world stage, and US imperialism is increasingly isolated on the world stage. Marco Rubio said just a week ago, we cannot ignore the impact that this has had on Israel's global standing. Trump just last Saturday says, Bibi has gone too far in Gaza, and Israel has lost a lot of support in the world. Now I will return all that support. I can make a prediction right now. He's not going to return that support. Phase 1 of the ceasefire agreement has been agreed to, but there's a lot of other phases here. Phase 1 has been the easy part. There's no guarantee that this is going to carry out. And certainly what it doesn't guarantee is that there's going to be any resolution or any stability in the region. The question of the oppression of the Palestinian people has not been resolved. But the Italian working class has showed the world that this is a working class issue. This is not just some faraway crime against humanity to be decried in humanitarian terms. This is part of a class war that is being waged against the workers of the world, because every Western government and many beyond are aiding and abetting Israel's crimes while they are attacking the workers at home. Suffering at home is allowing suffering abroad to take place. And the dock workers pointed this out. They said, we have the power. Actually, the Italian dock workers organized an international meeting of dock workers of the rest of Europe and said, we have it in our power to decide what docks, what gets shipped, what gets loaded, and what doesn't. And so they're making it a working class issue. This is a remarkable confirmation of the perspectives of this international, because they're showing that in practice, these are the methods that we've advocated. It shows that all along what was needed was a spark, some organized force to say, this is the way that we can mobilize. This is the power of the working class. Here's how we use it. And they gave the right call at the right time. And it wasn't just a random group of activists from the outside. It was organized workers. It was these dock workers saying, if they touch the flotilla, we're going to shut it down. And we're not just saying we're going to shut it down into a megaphone. We're going to paralyze the economy. And they begin with the docks. And they call on mass solidarity from the local population. And big demonstrations come up and back up the dock workers. And they do begin to shut it down. And that movement begins to spread. And initially, the CGIL, which is the National Federation of Trade Unions in Italy, it's like the AFL-CIO in the US. They have 5 million workers. It's a very conservative leadership. This is the establishment labor leaders. Initially, they opposed it. They had no intention of calling a general strike. But the movement from below forced them to. It forced them to get on board. The pressure that they were feeling from their own ranks forced their hand. And suddenly, this 5 million strong union confederation is calling for an official general strike. And that is the way that you mobilize the mass of the working class. It cannot be done by a small minority. It cannot be done from the outside. It needs to be done from the top. It needs to be done from the organizations of the working class. And this shows how this can happen. Now, of course, this hasn't happened in the US yet, but it can, and it will. That's the lesson of these events, is that before the Italian workers moved, you could have looked at that situation on the surface and say, why are people not moving? Why is there so much apathy? But the discontent was building below. It was waiting for an outlet. As soon as the outlet's provided, you see this explosion of a social wildfire. That is waiting to happen in the United States as well. Now, we have a very passive, conservative labor leadership in this country. An incredibly pathetic labor leadership that has overseen a decades-long decline. And the apparent ebb in the Palestine solidarity movement in this country is largely due to that, to the role of the labor leaders. But that dam of silence and inaction, that can be broken. Those floodgates can be broken. And then everything can be ignited. That's the lessons of this.
The U.S. imperialist embargo on Cuba is a vicious attack on the Cuban people. It has caused over $5 billion in damages to Cuba just from March 2023 to the end of February of this year. Now, Trump made the embargo more brutal, but Biden has not changed any of these brutal policies. We also object to including Cuba on the list of nations sponsoring terrorism. This is real hypocrisy coming from the United States imperialism, which has blood on its hands when you look at the people being killed in Gaza and Lebanon. The American imperialist embargo has ravaged Cuba for 62 years and counting. The revolutionary communists of America are committed to ending it once and for all. The embargo will only be defeated through a relentless class struggle to overthrow American capitalism and establish a workers' government.
So, my name is Dan Baker. I'm about to read From What is Marxism, and then I'm going to do my daily routine of meditation, yoga, and martial arts workout. And right now I'm just looking at my notes to see what the plan is today. And today is day 5. I'm working on increasing consecutive days of training. And so I'm doing endurance for November and December, endurance training in my daily routine of martial arts workout. And so I went for a 30-minute walk today with my partner, but I still have to do my yoga and martial arts routine. But before that, I'm going to do some reading out loud here in a minute, and then I'm going to do meditation, then yoga, then martial arts. So today, the martial arts is I'm going to review all the stuff, all the techniques I've been working on, and I'm just going to freestyle whatever I feel like doing, while following the format of a full body, legs, upper body, core routine where I'll do 1 minute of each and then repeat over and over for at least 30 minutes. But I'm going to push for 45 minutes because I'm trying to slowly increase how much I'm training each day. And I went 45 minutes the other day, and I'm trying to get back to that. So let's see. So yeah, goal is 45 minutes of martial arts training. And I'm also going to try to do as long of a yoga practice as I can handle, because I don't have to be at work until later tomorrow, so I'm going to train later tonight because my work schedule is changing. So for those of you tuning in, I'm about to read From What is Marxism, and then I'm going to do meditation, yoga, and martial arts back to back. And this is the endurance block, so this is going to be a really long workout tonight. And I invite you to join me. Alright. So I'm going to pause this music. I'm going to clean off the camera here and bring it in so you can hear me. Sorry, buddy. I've got a really low-tech situation going on. Just got this little wireless charging stand, and I've got my yoga mat and a watch. I play the audiobooks and the music on my Nintendo Switch, and it's just a working class situation, so I can share these ideas with you. So, picking up where we left off yesterday, and I am a communist. I am a sympathizer of the Revolutionary Communists of America, and I recruit and fundraise for them. And I'm learning about their views of Marxism and revolution. So now we're at this section, what is Marxist economics, and subsection Marxism and Keynesianism. Theories of underconsumption are often confused with Marx's ideas, but these are not the same. While underconsumption certainly exists for the masses, as any worker can testify, it is not the direct cause of capitalist crisis. If that was the cause, there would be permanent crisis from the first day of capitalism's existence. Modern underconsumption theory is closely identified with John Maynard Keynes, who believed that the problem of the lack of effective demand could be resolved by the intervention of the state. The state, through deficit financing, would plug the gap. In effect, the state would pay people to dig holes and fill them in again. These workers would then spend their wages and create new demand further down the line, thus solving the problem. But there is an inherent snag. The theory of underconsumption overlooks the basic fact that capitalist production is production for profit and not for consumption. If there is no profit, there will be no production. The disparity between the productive capacity in the economy and the purchasing power of the masses will continue so long as there is production for profit. Marx answered the Keynesian argument long ago. Quote, "It is sheer tautology to say that crises are caused by the scarcity of effective consumption or of effective consumers. The capitalist system does not know any other modes of consumption than effective ones, except that of sub forma pauperis, or of the thief." That's interesting because when I was in federal prison, when I was a political prisoner, for a Facebook post against Trump, you can submit a lawsuit against the staff or the warden of a prison in a format called in forma pauperis, which means because you're poor and you can't afford a lawyer. So if you can't afford a lawyer and you're a political prisoner in federal prison, you can submit a lawsuit against the warden, against the prison staff, in forma pauperis as a poor person, without a lawyer, because you cannot afford a lawyer and you can't afford the fine that you have to pay in order to file a lawsuit. And here they're talking about sub forma pauperis, which is referring to a thief, sort of the opposite, I guess. Continuing on, Marx says, quote, "That commodities are unsaleable means only that no effective purchasers have been found for them, i.e. consumers, since commodities are bought in the final analysis for productive or individual consumption. But if one were to attempt to give this tautology the semblance of a profounder justification by saying that the working class receives too small a portion of its own product, and the evil would be remedied as soon as it receives a larger share of it, and its wages increase in consequence, one could only remark that crises are always prepared by precisely a period in which wages rise generally, and the working class actually gets a larger share of that part of the annual product which is intended for consumption. From the point of view of these advocates of sound and simple common sense, such a period should rather remove the crisis." End quote. In other words, wages tend to rise at the peak of a boom, where labor tends to be in short supply, therefore before a slump in the economy. Therefore, the immediate lack of demand, one element, cannot be considered the real cause of the crisis of overproduction, as the Keynesians believe. So these are difficult concepts for me, and I'm going to have to review this later and ask more experienced comrades about it. The whole fallacy of Keynesianism rests on the inability to understand that crisis is not something incidental or external to the workings of capitalism, but springs from the inherent contradictions of capitalist production itself. While the capitalists attempt to keep wages as low as possible, they also produce as much as possible for an unknown market. This is especially the case at the height of a boom, just before the crash. Of course, while we fight for higher wages, the idea that this will solve the crisis of capitalism is utterly false. In fact, on a capitalist basis, increased wages will simply eat into profits and push the capitalists to cut back on investment in production, thereby exacerbating the capitalist crisis. It is impossible to create demand from thin air. The laws of capitalism are based upon a system of commodity production, which includes labor power. The illusion of demand management has of course gained a truth in it. The illusion of demand management has of course a grain of truth in it, but it is not entirely one-sided. It is clear that the demand side of capitalism in a crisis is lacking. But this is only the other side of the fact. This is only the other side of the fact that the working class receives in wages only a part of the value that it produces. Therefore, as already underlined, it cannot afford to buy back the goods which are produced. As Marx pointed out, the problem is not why there is a crisis, but why there is not a permanent crisis. The answer to this, as explained above, the division between two sectors, the production of consumer goods and the production of the means of production. So long as the surplus extracted from the labor of the working class is reinvested into industry, machinery, and infrastructure, the system can develop, albeit preparing the way for a new, deeper crisis in the future. Workers cannot buy back all of the goods they produce, and therefore reinvestment of the surplus in society is the key to the continual development of capitalist economy. However, this process cannot last forever, and instead only produces further contradictions. The call for the state to create, demand, or reflate the economy as a solution to capitalist crisis is also utopian. The attempt to use the printing press to create money, not backed by the production of more commodities, will only serve to fuel inflation and reduce workers' income. The only other way for the state to increase spending is to take in more through increased taxation. But taxation can only come from the capitalists or the working class. To tax the capitalists will mean cutting into profits, which will discourage them from investing. To tax the working class will cut into their consumption, thereby reducing demand further still. If the state resorts to borrowing, this will sooner or later need to be paid back, with interest. At the end of the day, such solutions simply intensify the contradictions of capitalism, not resolve them. It is a catch-22 situation for capitalism, from which there is no way out and no escape. The abandonment of Keynesianism and the return to orthodox economics is simply moving from the frying pan into the fire. The capitalists have gone back to sound budgets and the unfettered rule of the market, at least in words. This has only prepared an even bigger disaster. The turn towards laissez-faire economics is a product of the impasse of capitalism, and is no solution to the contradictions the ruling class faces. The Marxist theory of crisis is based upon an analysis of insoluble contradictions: the unlimited drive to produce, which is unique to the capitalist mode of production, combined with the limited consumption of the masses arising from their social position. As a consequence, capitalism is like a man sawing away at the branch on which he is sitting. Crises are epidemic to the capitalist system. It simultaneously creates and destroys the market at the same time, by squeezing more and more surplus value out of the working class, while attempting to hold down wages to the bare minimum. This in turn becomes a barrier to the expansion of the market, and therefore the realization of surplus value, as we are witnessing in this present period of permanent austerity. Capitalism and socialism. Capitalism is a crisis-ridden system where the law of value asserts itself by way of crisis. The contradictions which have reached their limits are a product of the capitalist system. Nevertheless, the system will not fall of its own volition. It will need to be overthrown by the conscious movement of the working class, the revolutionary class created in the womb of capitalism. Capitalism, in developing the productive forces, creates the basis for a new, higher form of society. This is the historical justification for class society. Private ownership in the nation-state have now become a colossal barrier to the further development of the productive forces. The capitalist system has exhausted itself, as graphically illustrated in the present crisis of deepening austerity and mass unemployment. Instead of capitalist anarchy, private ownership of the means of production will need to be abolished and replaced by a rationally planned economy. Of course, we are not in favor of taking over the small shops and small businesses, but of the giant economic levers that dominate the economy. In order to create a unified system of credit and investment, together with the introduction of a rational plan based on our needs, it will be necessary to take over the banks and finance houses and merge them into a national credit and banking system. This is a prerequisite for a democratic economic planning. This will not mean the seizure of ordinary people's bank deposits. On the contrary, a publicly owned state bank will create much more favorable terms for small depositors than the profit-greedy private banks. In the same way, it will be able to provide cheap credit for small businesses presently crushed by big monopolies. The giant companies that dominate the economy will be taken over without compensation and run democratically under workers' control and management. The task is to reorganize the whole system of production and distribution on a more dignified and workable basis. Such resources, bequeathed by capitalism, can then be used to abolish unemployment and drastically reduce the working week. This will be accomplished by a substantial rise in living standards and will provide the means for working people to be involved in the running of society. Under capitalism, the capitalists plan production within their factories and corporations. They would not dream of allowing blind market forces to operate within their factories. They themselves decide how to best combine workers and machines to generate the optimum results. If they allowed the market to do this, they would be driven out of business. The capitalists devise their own planning arrangements. The conscious control over economic life, which will take place under socialism, begins to develop, albeit in a hierarchical and coercive form, in the capitalist factory. How different things are once you leave the factory, where nothing is planned or foreseen, and everything is left to the, quote, invisible hand. How different things are once you leave... Oh, sorry, I read that already. What a contrast to the anarchy of production in relation to the capitalist economy as a whole. This alone shows how the market economy is an unnatural way to run our lives and needs to be replaced. A nationalized economy run under democratic workers' control and management would mean that conscious planning and control, not market forces, and the law of value, would decide the most efficient use of resources. Given the technology that now exists, a collective, democratically and rationally planned society is entirely possible. The fact that today the mobile phone and the computer have become ubiquitous opens up possibilities for popular democratic participation that could not have been dreamed of 50 years ago. With new technology and automation in production, almost any job that involves sitting in front of a screen and manipulating information is either disappearing or will do so soon. Offshore workers in India are just as vulnerable as their counterparts in the West. Blue-collar and white-collar workers face the same bleak future under capitalism. China is the fastest-growing market for robots. No human can compete with the relentless falling costs of automation. But as labor becomes uneconomic relative to machines, purchasing power diminishes. The capitalist system finds itself in a massive contradiction. It cannot utilize the technological, scientific, and productive potential it has brought into being. A future of prosperity faces the human race, providing it can harness this potential. Soul-destroying work can be abolished. A vast social and cultural transformation is within our grasp. But on a capitalist basis, a nightmare is opening up. It will be a merciless race to the bottom. The task facing us is to sweep away the capitalist system. That is the only alternative. Toward the end of the 19th century, Paul Lafargue, a French Marxist, wrote a pamphlet called The Right to be Lazy. It put forward the virtues of ending the drudgery of work and the need for leisure time. The ruling class have always had a monopoly over art, science, culture, and government. It is time that the ordinary working people had genuine access to and control over these things. The reason the rich have had time for that shit is because they've had leisure time, because they're making us all do all the hard work. Continuing on, socialism would abolish the waste, duplication, and inefficiency of capitalism and do away with the anarchic free-for-all of the market. Resources, including the allocation of social labor, will take place rationally and according to social requirements. It would transform our lives and transform the world in which we live in the most wondrous ways. Economic value, which is a category that belongs to commodity production, will disappear with this mode of production. As Engels correctly commented, quote, "People will be able to manage everything very simply without the intervention of the much vaunted value." End quote. For the first time, humanity would control its own destiny. This is the end of this chapter. The next chapter is called The Living Thoughts of Karl Marx, an extract by Leon Trotsky in 1939. Certain of Marx's argumentations, especially in the first, the most difficult chapter may seem to the uninitiated reader far too discursory, hair-splitting, or metaphysical. As a matter of fact, this impression arises in consequence of the want of habit to approach overly habitual phenomenon scientifically. The commodity has become such an all-pervasive, customary, and familiar part of our daily existence that we, lulled to sleep, do not even attempt to consider why men relinquish important objects needed to sustain life in exchange for tiny discs of gold or silver that are of no earthly use whatsoever. The matter is not limited to the commodity. One and all of the categories, the basic concepts, of market economy seem to be accepted without analysis as self-evident, as if they were the natural basis of human relation. Yet, while the realities of the economic process are human labor, raw materials, tools, machines, division of labor, the necessity to distribute finished products among the participants of the labor process, and the like, such categories such as commodity, money, wages, capital, profit, tax, and the like, are only semi-mystical reflections in men's head of the various aspects of a process of economy which they do not understand and which is not under their control. To decipher them, a thoroughgoing scientific analysis is indispensable. In the United States, where a man who owns $1 million is referred to as being worth $1 million, market concepts have sunk in deeper than anywhere else. Until recently, Americans gave very little thought to the nature of economic relations. In the land of the most powerful economic system, economic theory continued to be exceedingly barren. Only the present deep-going crisis of American economy has bluntly confronted public opinion with the fundamental problems of capitalist society. In any event, whoever has not overcome the habit of uncritically accepting the ready-made ideological reflections of economic development, whoever has not reasoned out, in the footsteps of Marx, the essential nature of the commodity as the basic cell of the capitalist organism, will prove to be forever incapable of scientifically comprehending the most important and the most acute manifestations of our epoch. The next section is called Marx's Method. So basically, he's saying that if you don't understand how the economy works, you will be a wage slave, and your children will be wage slaves, and so will their children, because you won't be angry enough to get up and overthrow the system that enslaves you. Because you don't understand the invisible chains that enslave you. Marx's method. Having established science as cognition of the objective recurrences of nature, man has tried stubbornly and persistently to exclude himself from science, reserving for himself special privileges in the shape of alleged intercourse with suspensory forces, religion, or with timeless moral precepts, idealism. Marx deprived man of these odious privileges definitively and forever, looking upon him as a natural link to the evolutionary process of material nature, upon human society as the organization of production and distribution, upon capitalism as the stage in the development of human society. It was not Marx's aim to discover the eternal laws of economy. He denied the existence of such laws. The history of the development of human society is the history of succession of various systems of economy, which operating in accordance with its own laws. The transition from one system to another was always determined by the growth of the productive forces, i.e., of technique and the organization of labor. Up to a certain point, social changes are quantitative in character and do not alter the foundations of society, the prevalent forms of property. But a point is reached when the matured productive forces can no longer contain themselves within the old forms of property. Then follows a radical change in the social order, accompanied by shocks. The primitive commune was either superseded or supplemented by slavery. Slavery was succeeded by serfdom with its feudal superstructure. The commercial development of cities brought Europe in the 16th century to the capitalist order, which thereupon passed through several stages. In his Capital, Marx does not study economy in general, but capitalist economy, which has its own specific laws. Only in passing does he refer to the other economic systems to elucidate the characteristics of capitalism. The self-sufficient economy of the primitive peasant family has no need of political economy, for it is dominated on the one hand by the forces of nature and on the other by the forces of tradition. The self-contained natural economy of the Greeks or the Romans, founded on slave labor, was ruled by the will of the slave owners, whose plan in turn was directly determined by the laws of nature and routine. The same might also be said of the medieval estate with its peasant serfs. In all these instances, economic relations were clear and transparent in their primitive crudity. But the case of contemporary society is altogether different. It destroyed the old self-contained connections and the inherited modes of labor. The new economic relations have linked cities and villages, provinces and nations. Division of labor has encompassed the planet, having shattered tradition and routine. These bonds have not composed themselves to the same definite plan, but rather apart from human consciousness and foresight, and it would seem as if behind the very backs of men. The interdependence of men, groups, classes, nations, which follows from the division of labor, is not directed or managed by anyone. People work for each other without knowing each other, without inquiring about one another's needs, in the hope, and even with the assurance that their relations will somehow regulate themselves, and by and large they do, or rather were wont to. It is utterly impossible to seek the causes for the recurrences of capitalist society in the subjective consciousness, in the intentions or plans of its members. The subjective recurrences of capitalism were formulated before science began to think about them seriously. To this day, the preponderant majority of men know nothing about the laws that govern capitalist economy. The whole strength of Marx's method was in his approach to economic phenomena, not from the subjective point of view of certain persons, but from the objective point of society as a whole. Just as an experimental natural scientist approaches a beehive or an anthill. For economic science, the decisive significance is what and how people do, not what they themselves think about their actions. At the base of society is not religion and morality, but nature and labor. Marx's method is materialistic because it proceeds from existence to consciousness, not the other way around. Marx's method is dialectic because it regards both nature and society as they evolve, and evolution itself as the constant struggle of conflicting forces. Marxism and official science. Marx had his predecessors, classical political economy, Adam Smith, David Ricardo, reaching its full bloom before capitalism had grown old, before it began to fear the morrow. Marx paid to the both great classicists the perfect tribute of profound gratitude. Nevertheless, the basic error of classical economics was its view of capitalism as humanity's normal existence for all time, instead of merely as one historical stage in the development of society. Marx began with a criticism of that political economy, exposed its errors as well as its contradictions of capitalism itself, and demonstrated the inevitability of its collapse. As Rosa Luxemburg has very aptly observed, Marx's economic teaching is a child of classical economics, a child whose birth cost its mother her life. Science does not reach its goal in the hermetically sealed study of the scholar, but in flesh and blood society. All the interests and passions that rend society asunder assert their influence on the development of science, especially of political economy, the science of wealth and poverty. The struggle of workers against capitalist forces the theoreticians of the bourgeoisie to turn their backs upon a scientific analysis of the system of exploitation and to busy themselves with a bare description of economic facts, a study of the economic past, and, what is immeasurably worse, a downright falsification of things as they are for the purpose of justifying the capitalist regime. The economic doctrine, which is nowadays taught in official institutions of learning and preached in the bourgeois press, offers no dearth of important factual material, yet it is utterly incapable of encompassing the economic processes as a whole and discovering its laws and perspectives, nor has it any desire to do so. Official political economy is dead. Real knowledge of capitalist society can be obtained only through Marx's Capital. I should go ahead and stop for now as far as the reading goes and switch to my meditations. Oh, actually, there's only just one little section left, so we'll go ahead and finish reading What is Marxism by Alan Woods and Rob Sewell, and then we'll go to 30 minutes of meditation while listening to audiobooks by Lenin. But for now, we're going to finish What is Marxism by Alan Woods in this last little section called The Three Sources and Three Components of Marxism, an extract by Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, 1913. Having recognized that the economic system is the foundation on which the political superstructure is erected, Marx devoted his greatest attention to the study of this economic system. Marx's principal work, Capital, is devoted to a study of the economic system of modern, i.e. capitalist society. Classical political economy, before Marx, evolved in England, the most developed of the capitalist countries. Adam Smith and David Ricardo, by their investigations of the economic system, laid the foundations of the labor theory of value. Marx continued their work. He provided a proof of the theory and developed it consistently. He showed that the value of every commodity is determined by the quantity of socially necessary labor time spent on its production. Where the bourgeois economics Where the bourgeoisie economists saw the relation between things, the exchange of one commodity for another, Marx revealed a relation between people. The exchange of commodities expressed the connection between individual producers through the market. Money signifies that the connection is becoming closer and closer, inseparably uniting the entire economic life of the individual producers into one whole. Capital signifies a further development of this connection. Man's labor power becomes a commodity. The wage worker sells his labor power to the owner of land, factories, and instruments of labor. The worker spends one part of the day covering the cost of maintaining himself and his family, wages, while the other part of his day he works without remuneration, creating for the capitalist surplus value, the source of profit, the source of the wealth of the capitalist class. The doctrine of surplus value is the cornerstone of Marx's economic theory. Capital, created by the labor of the worker, crushes the worker, ruining small proprietors and creating an army of unemployed. In industry, the victory of large-scale production is immediately apparent, but the same phenomenon is also to be observed in agriculture, where the superiority of large-scale capitalist agriculture is enhanced. The use of machinery increases, and the peasant economy, trapped by money capital, declines and falls into ruin under the burden of its backwards technique. The decline of small-scale production assumes different forms in agriculture, but the decline itself is an indisputable fact. By destroying small-scale production, capital leads to an increase in productivity of labor and to the creation of a monopoly position for the association of big capitalists. Production itself becomes more and more social. Hundreds of thousands and millions of workers become bound together in a regular economic organism. But the product of this collective labor is appropriated by a handful of capitalists. Anarchy of production, crisis, the furious chase after markets, and the insecurity of existence of the mass of the population are intensified. By increasing the dependence of workers on capital, the capitalist system creates the great power of united labor. Marx traced the development of capitalism from embryonic commodity economy, from simple exchange to its highest forms to large-scale production. And the experience of all capitalist countries, old and new, year by year, demonstrates clearly the truth of this Marxian doctrine to increasing numbers of workers. Capitalism has triumphed all over the world, but this triumph was only the prelude to the triumph of labor over capital. And this concludes What is Marxism? By Alan Woods and Rob Sewell. We have some questions and suggested reading at the end of this chapter, which we have at the end of each chapter in here, but I won't read aloud right now. I'm going to review this book and follow up with the reading, questions, and suggested reading, and that's going to take up my time and studies in the very near future here. And now we're going to switch to the meditation, yoga, and martial arts portion of my daily routine. I'm making sure I did not forget to dog ear one of these sections of suggested reading and questions. Okay, so that was What is Marxism? And now we're going to practice some meditation, yoga, and martial arts. While listening to Lenin audiobooks. And I don't believe in silent meditation because I think it's a waste of fucking time. You're just sitting there doing nothing, thinking about nothing, and what good is that to anyone? We need to grow as individuals and as a class of workers, and to do that, we need to listen and learn. So, I have been studying Lenin, I've been studying the Russian Revolution, and so that is what I meditate on. And so that is what we will be meditating on right now tonight. We'll be sitting quietly for 30 minutes, listening to audiobooks of Lenin, revolutionary stuff. And then we will practice some yoga and some martial arts with an emphasis on endurance for the next 2 months. And here we go.
Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. This file is being recorded for the December 2022 edition of Socialism for All. And it's an audiobook and discussion of The Revolutionary Upswing by Lenin from 1912. If you like this video, please click like and subscribe, and consider supporting on Patreon at patreon.com/socialismforall. There's a link to Patreon in the video description. So this article, The Revolutionary Upswing, was published early in June 1912 after Lenin had made, at a meeting of the Paris section of the RSDLP, or Russian Social Democratic Labor Party organization abroad, a report on developments in Russia, April 26, 1912, and read a paper entitled The Revolutionary Upswing of the Russian Proletariat. A printed notice issued by the Paris section of the RSDLP organization abroad gave a detailed outline of the paper coinciding with the main propositions of this article. So this piece was published in Social Democrat number 27, June 7, 1912, and published according to that text in Social Democrat. The source is Lenin Collected Works, Progress Publishers, 1975, Moscow, Volume 18. Translated by Stepan Presian, HTML transcription and markup by R. Symbala. It's in the public domain at the Lenin Internet Archive, within the Marxists Internet Archive, marxists.org. Thanks as usual to MIA for hosting this and thousands of other free Marxist texts. Please go check them out, link in description. So we want to add another note also. The Social Democrat, or the Social Democrat, was the central organ of the RSDLP, published illegally from February 1908 to January 1917. In all, 58 issues appeared. The first issue appeared in Russia, and then publication was transferred first to Paris, afterwards to Geneva. By decision of the Central Committee of the RSDLP, the editorial board consisted of representatives of the Bolsheviks, Mensheviks, and Polish Social Democrats. Social Democrat published more than 80 articles and other items by Lenin. On its editorial board, Lenin upheld a consistently Bolshevik line. Two members of the board, Kamenev and Zinoviev, took a conciliatory view of the liquidators and tried to defeat Lenin's line. Another two members, the Mensheviks Martov and Don, obstructed the work of the board and at the same time openly defended liquidationism in Golos Social Demokrata. Lenin's uncompromising struggle against the liquidators resulted in Martov and Don resigning from the editorial board in June 1911. From December 1911, the newspaper was edited by Lenin. So what was liquidationism or liquidators? So there were a number of struggles within Russian Marxism. Within about a 20-year period, Lenin eventually said that it had several major forms, but it essentially kind of was the same struggle over and over again. First against economism, Menshevism, liquidationism. The liquidators were basically Mensheviks who wanted to cast out the Bolsheviks and basically renounce the more illegal underground forms of struggle and just focus on the legal party framework. Lenin was adamantly opposed to this and wanted to keep all forms of the struggle united. That's what it would take to actually win. Anyway, eventually the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks did split, but anyway, this was a long fight, and had it not been resisted, it could have been much worse for the movement overall. It could have happened earlier and done more damage, and who knows how that would have turned out. Anyway, fortunately it didn't. But turning back to the piece, we're in June of 1912. What does that mean historically? Lenin's talking about the revolutionary upswing. Upswing from what? So basically the first Russian Revolution was 1905 to 1907. This was, major uprisings of the population against Tsarism, and certain reforms were won, and this was a great moment. However, reaction reared its head after that, and there were a number of really bad and oppressive years following that. Eventually, there was the Socialist Revolution in 1917. So here we are in 1912, kind of in the middle of that process. World War I is about a year out, going to start in 1914. Socialists are seeing that coming, that the great powers might be going to war, trying to decide what to do about that, etc. Anyway, at this point in time, after the first Russian Revolution, and then years of reaction and oppression, a revolutionary upswing. So let's read. The great May Day strike of the proletariat of all Russia and the accompanying street demonstrations, revolutionary leaflets, and revolutionary speeches before gatherings of workers have clearly shown that Russia has entered a period of revolutionary upswing. This upswing did not come as a bolt from the blue. The way had been paved for it over a long period by all the conditions of Russian life, and the mass strikes over the Elena shootings and the May Day strikes merely marked its actual arrival. The temporary triumph of the counter-revolution was inseparably bound up with the decline in the mass struggle of the workers. The number of strikers gives an approximate yet absolutely objective and precise idea of the extent of the struggle. During the 10 years preceding the revolution, from 1895 to 1904, the average number of strikers was 43,000 a year in round figures. In 1905, there were 2,750,000 strikers. In 1906, 1 million, and in 1907, 750,000. The 3 years of the revolution were distinguished by a rise in the strike movement of the proletariat unprecedented anywhere in the world. Its decline, which began in 1906 to 1907, became definite in 1908, when there were 175,000 strikers. The coup d'etat of June 3, 1907, which restored the autocratic rule of the Tsar in alliance with the Duma of the Black Hundred landlords and the commercial and industrial magnates, was an inevitable result of the flagging of the revolutionary energy of the masses. Quick comment, who are the Black Hundreds? Black Hundreds were extreme reactionaries, monarchists, anti-Semites, etc. So the idea that they were in alliance with the autocratic rule of the Tsar and efforts to restore it, not exactly surprising. So here, Lenin is drawing a connection between the decline of the strike movement and that revolutionary energy with the counter-revolution, the reaction, just waiting for the strikes to die down, and then they made their move and it was successful. Continuing. The 3 years, 1908 to 1910, were a period of Black Hundred counter-revolution at its worst, of liberal bourgeois renegacy and of proletarian despondency and disintegration. The number of strikers steadily dropped, reaching 60,000 in 1909 and 50,000 in 1910. However, a noticeable change set in at the end of 1910. The demonstrations in connection with the death of the liberal Muromtsev and of Leo Tolstoy, and also the student movement, clearly indicated that a fresh breeze had begun to blow, that the mood of the democratic masses had reached a turning point. The year 1911 saw the workers gradually going over to an offensive. The number of strikers rose to 100,000. Signs from various quarters indicate that the weariness and stupor brought about by the triumph of the counter-revolution are passing away, that once again there is an urge for revolution. In summing up the situation, the All-Russia Conference, held in January 1912, noted that, quote, the onset of a political revival is to be noted among broad democratic circles, chiefly among the proletariat. The workers' strikes in 1910 to 11, the beginning of demonstrations and proletarian meetings, the start of a movement among urban bourgeois Democrats, the student strikes, etc., are all indications of the growing revolutionary feelings of the masses against the June 3rd regime, unquote. By the second quarter of this year, these sentiments had become so strong that they manifested themselves in actions by the masses and brought about a revolutionary upswing. The course of events during the past 18 months shows with perfect clarity that there is nothing accidental in this upswing, that it has come quite naturally and was made inevitable by the whole development of Russia in the previous period. The Lena shootings, which, commenting, were also known as the Lena executions or the Lena massacre, was the massacre of striking workers at a gold mine, not dissimilar to the 1914 Ludlow massacre in Colorado, USA. Anyway, continuing, the Lena shootings led to the revolutionary temper of the masses developing into a revolutionary upswing of the masses. Nothing could be more false than the liberal invention, which Trotsky repeats in the Vienna Pravda after the liquidators, that, quote, the struggle for freedom of association is the basis of both the Elena tragedy and the powerful response to it in the country, unquote. Freedom of association was neither the specific nor the principal demand in the Lena strike. It was not lack of the freedom of association that the Lena shootings revealed, but lack of freedom from provocation, lack of rights in general, lack of freedom from wholesale tyranny. The Lena shootings, as we have already made clear in Social Democrat number 26, were an exact reflection of the entire regime of the June 3rd monarchy. It was not at all the struggle for one of the rights of the proletariat, even the most fundamental, the most important of them, that was characteristic of the Lena events. What was characteristic of those events was the complete absence of any kind of elementary legality. The characteristic feature was that an agent provocateur, a spy, a secret police agent, a menial of the Tsar, resorted to mass shootings without any political reason whatever. It is this general lack of rights typical of Russian life, this hopelessness and impossibility of fighting for particular rights, and this incorrigibility of the Tsarist monarchy and of its entire regime that stood out so distinctly against the background of the Lena events as to fire the masses with revolutionary ardor. The liberals have been straining every nerve to represent the Lena events and the May Day strikes as a trade union movement and a struggle for rights. But anyone who is not blinded by liberal and liquidationist controversies will see in them something different. They will see the revolutionary character of the mass strike, which is especially emphasized by the St. Petersburg May Day leaflet of various social democratic groups, and even of one group of worker socialist revolutionaries, which we reprint in full in our news section, and which repeats the slogans advanced by the All-Russia Conference of the RSDLP in January 1912. There's a footnote there. The leaflet mentioned by Lenin was printed in St. Petersburg and circulated at the factories before May 1st, 1912, which is, of course, May Day, the real Labor Day, International Workers' Day, not the fake one that we have in the United States, which was specifically separated from this in order to break off U.S. workers from having that international solidarity on that holiday. Continuing, it called on the workers to hold meetings and demonstrations in Nevsky Prospect on May Day, under the slogans put forward by the 6th Prague All-Russia Conference of the RSDLP, quote, a constituent assembly, an 8-hour working day, and confiscation of the landed estates. The leaflet ended with the militant appeals, quote, down with the Tsar's government, down with the autocratic constitution of June 3rd, long live a democratic republic, long live socialism. It was signed, Meeting of Representatives of All Organized Workers of St. Petersburg, Social Democratic Unity Group, City Central Social Democratic Group, Group of Worker Socialist Revolutionaries, Group of Worker Social Democrats of St. Petersburg, and representatives of May Day committees. On June 4, 1912, the full text of the leaflet was published in the news section of Social Democrat number 27. Back to the main text. And then, it is not really slogans that are the main proof of the revolutionary character of the Lena and May Day strikes. The slogans formulated what the facts showed. The mass strikes spreading from district to district, their tremendous growth, the speed with which they spread, the courage of the workers, the increased number of mass meetings and revolutionary speeches, the demand that the fines imposed for celebrating May Day be canceled, and the combination of the political and the economic strike, familiar to us from the time of the First Russian Revolution, are all obvious indications of the true nature of the movement, which is a revolutionary upswing of the masses. Let us recall the experience of 1905. Events show that the tradition of the revolutionary mass strike lives on among the workers, and that the workers at once took up and revived this tradition. The strike wave of 1905, unprecedented in the world, involved 810,000 strikers during the first and 1,277,000 during the last quarter of the year, being a combination of the political and the economic strike. According to tentative estimates, the strikes over the Lena events involved about 300,000 workers, and the May Day strikes about 400,000. And the strike movement continues to grow. Every day, the newspapers, even the liberal ones, bring news of how the wildfire of strikes is spreading. The second quarter of 1912 is not quite over, and yet it is already becoming quite obvious that, as regards the size of the strike movement, the beginning of the revolutionary upswing in 1912 is not lower, but rather higher than the beginning in 1905. The Russian Revolution was the first to develop on a large scale this proletarian method of agitation, of rousing and uniting the masses, and of drawing them into the struggle. Now the proletariat is applying this method once again, and with an even firmer hand. No power on earth could achieve what the revolutionary vanguard of the proletariat is achieving by this method. A huge country with a population of 150 million spread over a vast area, scattered, oppressed, deprived of all rights, ignorant, fenced off from, quote, evil influences by a swarm of authorities, police, spies. The whole of this country is getting into a ferment. The most backward sections, both of the workers and the peasants, are coming into direct or indirect contact with the strikers. Hundreds of thousands of revolutionary agitators are all at once appearing on the scene. Their influence is infinitely increased by the fact that they are inseparably linked with the rank and file, with the masses, and that they remain among them, fight for the most urgent needs of every worker's family, and combine with this immediate struggle for urgent economic needs their political protest and struggle against the monarchy. Comment, modern organizers take note. Continuing, for counter-revolution has stirred up in millions and tens of millions of people a bitter hatred for the monarchy. It has given them the rudiments of an understanding of the part played by it, and now the slogan of the foremost workers of the capital, "Long live the Democratic Republic," spreads through thousands of channels in the wake of every strike, reaching the backward sections, the remotest provinces, the people, the, quote, depths of Russia. Very characteristic are the comments made on strikes by Severyanin, a liberal, which were welcomed by Russkiya Vedomosti and sympathetically reprinted by Wretch. Quote, have the workers any grounds for admixing economic or any demands to a May Day strike? Asks Mr. Severyanin, and he answers, I make bold to think that they have none. Every economic strike can and should be begun only after a serious weighing of its chances of success. That is why, more often than not, it is unreasonable to link such strikes with May Day. Indeed, it would be rather strange to do so. We are celebrating the International Workers' Holiday, and we use the occasion to demand a 10% rise for calico of such and such grades, unquote. That is how the liberal reasons, and this piece of infinite vulgarity, meanness, and nastiness is sympathetically accepted by the, quote, best liberal papers, which claim to be democratic. The crudest self-interest of a bourgeois, the vilest cowardice of a counter-revolutionary, that is what lies behind the florid phrases of the liberal. He wants the pockets of the employers to be safe. He wants an orderly and harmless demonstration in favor of freedom of association. But the proletariat, instead of this, is drawing the masses into a revolutionary strike, which indissolubly links politics with economics, a strike which wins the support of the most backward sections by the success of the struggle for an immediate improvement in the life of the workers, and at the same time rouses the people against the czarist monarchy. Quick comment here. So we talked about economism before. These were people who are trying to split the economic struggle from the political struggle. And Lenin and the Bolsheviks resisted that. So there's kind of a good example of that. Lenin said that economism could result in trade union consciousness. In other words, an understanding that uniting could bring better conditions on the job, better pay, things like that. But that it was also essential for workers to develop political consciousness and to do political organizing and have a proletarian political party. Economists wanted to separate these things and leave the political side of it just to the intelligentsia. Fine denunciation of it there by Lenin. Continuing. Yes, the experience of 1905 created a deep-rooted and great tradition of mass strikes, and we must not forget the results that these strikes produce in Russia. Stubborn mass strikes are inseparably bound up in our country with armed uprising. Let these words not be misinterpreted. It is by no means a question of a call for an uprising. Such a call would be most unwise at the present moment. It is a question of establishing the connection between strike and uprising in Russia. How did the uprising grow in 1905? Firstly, mass strikes, demonstrations, and meetings made clashes between the people and the police and troops more and more frequent. Secondly, The mass strikes roused the peasantry to a number of partial, fragmentary, semi-spontaneous revolts. Thirdly, the mass strikes very soon spread to the army and navy, causing clashes on economic grounds, the bean and similar mutinies, and subsequently insurrections. Fourthly, the counter-revolution itself started civil war by pogroms, by violence against Democrats, and so on. The revolution of 1905 was defeated not because it had gone too far, or because the December uprising was artificial, as renegades among the liberals and their like imagine. On the contrary, the cause of the defeat was that the uprising did not go far enough. Shades of on authority here by Engels. That the realization of its necessity was not sufficiently widespread and firmly assimilated among the revolutionary classes. That the uprising was not concerted, resolute, organized, simultaneous, aggressive. Quick footnote here, the December uprising was the armed uprising of the Moscow workers against the autocracy in December 1905. For 9 days, the workers, led by the Moscow Bolshevik Social Democrats, fought gallantly on the barricades against the Tsar's troops. The government did not succeed in crushing the revolt until fresh troops arrived from St. Petersburg. It dealt with the insurgents with monstrous cruelty. The workers' districts ran with blood, and thousands of workers were killed in Moscow and the vicinity. Back to the main text. Let us see now whether signs of a gathering revolt are in evidence at present. In order not to be carried away by revolutionary enthusiasm, let's take the testimony of the Octoberists. The German Union of Octoberists in St. Petersburg consists mainly of so-called left and constitutional Octoberists who are particularly popular among the cadets and who are most capable, in comparison with the other Octoberists and cadets, of observing events, quote, objectively, without making it their aim to frighten the authorities with the prospect of revolution. Cadets commenting were the main bourgeois party, Constitutional Democrats. Here is what the St. Petersburger Zeitung, the newspaper of these Octoberists, wrote in its weekly political review on May 6. Quote, May has come. Regardless of the weather, this is usually not a very pleasant month for the inhabitants of the capital, because it begins with the proletarian holiday. This year, with the impression of the Lena demonstrations still fresh in the minds of the workers, May Day was particularly dangerous. The atmosphere of the capital, saturated with all sorts of rumors about strikes and demonstrations, portended a fire. Our loyal police were visibly agitated. They organized searches, arrested some persons, and mobilized large forces to prevent street demonstrations. The fact that the police could think of nothing more clever than to raid the editorial offices of the workers' papers and arrest their editors does not testify to a particularly intimate knowledge of the wires by which the puppet regiments of the workers were pulled. Yet such wires exist. This is evident from the disciplined character of the strike and from many other circumstances. That is why this May Day strike, the largest we have witnessed so far, was so ominous. There were some 100,000 or perhaps even 150,000 workers of big and small workshops on strike. It was only a peaceful parade, but the solid unity of that army was remarkable, all the more because the recent unrest among the workers was accompanied by other alarming facts. On various naval vessels, sailors were arrested for conducting revolutionary propaganda. Judging by all the information that has got into the press, the situation is not very good on our naval vessels, which are not numerous as it is. The railwaymen are also giving cause for anxiety. True, matters nowhere went so far as an attempt to call a strike, but arrests, including such a conspicuous one as that of A.A. Ushakov, an assistant station master on the Nikolaevskaya Railway, show that there is a certain danger there as well. Attempts at revolution on the part of immature worker masses can, of course, have only a harmful effect on the outcome of the Duma elections. That was the parliament set up after the 1905 revolution. These attempts are all the more unreasonable because the Tsar has appointed Manukin, and the Council of State has passed the workers' insurance bill, unquote. That is how a German Octoberist reasons. We, on our part, must remark that we have received exact first-hand information about the sailors, which proves that Novoye Vremya has exaggerated and inflated the matter. The Okhrana is obviously working in agent provocateur fashion. Footnote there, the Okhrana was an agency of the secret police in Tsarist Russia in charge of political investigation. It was under the jurisdiction of the police department. Back to the main text. Premature attempts at an uprising would be extremely unwise. The working class vanguard must understand that the support of the working class by the democratic peasantry and the active participation of the armed forces are the main conditions for a timely, i.e. successful, armed uprising in Russia. Mass strikes and revolutionary epics have their objective logic. They scatter hundreds of thousands and millions of sparks in all directions. And all around, there is the inflammable material of extreme bitterness, torture of unprecedented starvation, endless tyranny, shameless and cynical mockery at the pauper, the mujik, the rank-and-file soldier. Add to this the perfectly unbridled, pogromist Jew-baiting carried on by the Black Hundreds and stealthily fostered and directed by the court gang of the dull-witted and bloodthirsty Nicholas Romanov. Quote, "So it was, so it will be." These revealing words were uttered by the minister Makarov to his own misfortune and to the misfortune of his class and his landlord Tsar. The revolutionary upswing of the masses imposes great and responsible duties on every working class social democrat, on every honest democrat. Quote, "All-around support for the movement of the masses that is beginning, or we should say already the revolutionary movement of the masses that has begun, and its expansion on the basis of full implementation of the party's slogans." This is how the All-Russia Conference of the RSDLP defined these duties. The party slogans, a democratic republic, an 8-hour day, confiscation of all the landed estates, must become the slogans of all Democrats, of the people's revolution. To be able to support and extend the movement of the masses, we need organization and more organization. Without an illegal party, we cannot carry on this work, and there is no point in just talking about it. In supporting and extending the onslaught of the masses, we must carefully take into account the experience of 1905, and in explaining the need for and inevitability of an uprising, we must warn against and keep off premature attempts. The growth of mass strikes, the enlistment of other classes in the struggle, the state of the organizations, and the temper of the masses will all suggest of themselves the moment when all forces must unite in a concerted, resolute, aggressive, supremely courageous onslaught of the revolution on the Tsarist monarchy. Without a victorious revolution, there will be no freedom in Russia. Without the overthrow of the Tsarist monarchy by a proletarian and peasant uprising, there will be no victorious revolution in Russia. That's the end of the audiobook. So I think that this is pretty easy to follow, probably. Leave questions or comments below and we can continue the discussion there as always. And, we're always trying to tie this into present day political questions. So, this is why we study history and theories, to be able to solve political questions that are before us today, not just to, debate what happened in years past. It is to form the movement to successfully abolish capitalism across the entire earth. So taking seriously this point about the mass strikes and strike waves being tied to the spirit of the people rebelling against the system, that the revolution of 1905 saw a peak of the number of strikes and then it waned in the following years, and then counter-revolution was able to basically just wait for its moment, pick a window when the workers seemed like they had all gone back to sleep and been dispirited or whatever, and launched their counter-revolution. And what we see today is a number of decades of the labor movement decreasing in numbers. That's for a variety of reasons we've discussed in other places. But overall, the organized activity of class-conscious workers has been kind of on the downward trend for a number of decades, and we're finally seeing maybe an upward trend in it again, the beginnings of one at least. And this came out through a number of different conditions. COVID, the inflation, all kinds of stuff is going on and has been, not just in the last few years. I mean, the extreme reaction of Trump and the rise of pretty concerted neo-fascist movement in the United States, and then the Democrats' fascist collaborating response to all of this, where they will oppose it in words, but then politically they refuse to ally with the left to actually, stamp any of it out. Going back to 2008, worldwide financial meltdown, we're finally maybe seeing now that people have been pushed far enough to, get out in the streets as we saw in 2020, etc. Now, whether that's going to be just confined to presidential election years when, people turn their political brain back on for 6 months, once every 4 years, or whether this is going to extend to become, an all-encompassing movement for economic rights, for political rights, and, against the system, against imperialism, fascism, etc. Not in a shallow liberal way, and we've discussed this in the live streams and elsewhere, liberals have a kind of shallow, superficial anti-fascism, which basically just amounts to a disagreement with the more open reactionaries about how best to govern capitalism. Fascism is basically capitalism in crisis. It's, how they beat back any threat of a socialist movement during a time of vulnerability for capitalism, which certainly is happening now. But anyway, the more overt reactionaries and then the more covert reactionaries, both of whom defend capitalism, this is stylistic difference of, don't roll out the fascism yet, it's distasteful, etc. But again, the liberals, know that at the end of the day, capitalism need be defended by any means necessary, regardless of what they're saying. So don't trust their anti-fascism. It's just like anti-imperialism. You can't have real anti-imperialism without socialism, because it's an outgrowth of capitalism. It's just late-stage capitalism becomes imperialist. It has to spread beyond the home market and extend out into conquering other lands. And out there in the world, it has conflicts with other capitalists trying to do the same thing. Now, the capitalists will form blocks, and as soon as you get two major competing blocks, you get a world war. This is what we've seen in the past. It's likely to happen again. What's the only real way out? Class struggle to abolish capitalism, build socialism. This is how you actually end fascism, end imperialism, end world war, end the decay of capitalism trying to sustain itself after any notion of it being a liberating force for freedom has long since passed. That was a much earlier stage of capitalism, and even then it was very self-interested. So again, we're now in a period where we're trying to build a left that will not be co-opted by vague, thin, liberal, superficial notions of anti-fascism or anti-imperialism. All of this will just tie back into making the current system grow. So as we see more strike activity and demonstrations popping up from year to year and things like that, can we keep this out of the clutches of getting co-opted by the system? I see that as one of the main tasks, and as I say, the fundamental task of the US left is to break with the Democratic Party, for example, and to build something independent, free of it, where it's not dominated by capitalist influence in your organizing space. That's never really going to help you. So in many ways, we have to break free of all the different tentacles of world capitalism, imperialism, fascism. It takes many different forms. There are forms even trying to call themselves Marxist, and we need to actually educate people to have the intellectual immune system and the class consciousness to see through that, to analyze and reject and defeat it. And so that, I think, is the work that needs to be done right now. Anyway, again, questions or comments, leave them below. We'll continue the discussion in the comment section as always. Otherwise, thanks for listening. And thanks to the current patrons whose names are on the screen. If you'd like to get your name on the screen, head to patreon.com/socialismforall. The donations are encouraging and materially helpful. I would make content even if nobody donated, but that support allows me to spend a lot more time on it than I would be able to do without it. So don't take it for granted. If you like this channel, thank a patron and consider becoming one yourself. Then engagement counts. Like, share, subscribe. That helps YouTube to recommend this content to more people, keeps the community growing, and growth is exactly what we've been seeing. The channel's been growing by anywhere from 400 to 600 subscribers per month for over a year now, so that's great. We welcome everybody into the fold. Join us on live streams, usually held on Wednesday right now at twitch.tv/socialisms4a, and just keep it flowing. As the channel expands, we're trying to bring more and more people into this conversation for agitation, for education, and then eventually for you to go into your community and organize. That's where that really happens. Get to know your local left, such as it may be. In some places, it's pretty good and well organized. In other places, there's little going on. But network with who is there, even if it's on a statewide level. Make yourself available. Find some projects that you can contribute to on a sustained basis, And the next time that there is another round of nationwide protests going on, you'll be in a better position. You'll already be in a network for trying to take them as far as they can go reasonably. Again, supporting the masses. Nobody really likes being exploited and oppressed as we are in the system, but it only flares up from time to time. Part of the goal of communists is to take these spontaneous uprisings of the masses and help organize them and advise them into something more sustained and constructive. All right, thanks again, and we will see you in the next video. Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. This file is being recorded for the February 2021 edition of Socialism for All. It's an audiobook of Theses on the National Question by V.I. Lenin from 1913. If you like this video, please click the like button and the subscribe button, and consider supporting us on Patreon. As usual, thanks to the Marxists Internet Archive, Marxists.org, for hosting this text. It was written in June 1913, first published in 1925 in the Lenin Miscellany 3, published according to the manuscript. Sources: Lenin Collected Works, Progress Publishers, 1977, Moscow, Volume 10, translated by the late George Hanna, transcription and HTML markup by R. Simbala, and it's in the public domain, Lenin Internet Archive, 2004. So let's get into the audiobook, remembering just for historical context that June 1913 is just a few years before the successful Russian Revolution of 1917. Point 1. The article of our program on the self-determination of nations cannot be interpreted to mean anything but political self-determination, i.e., the right to secede and form a separate state. Point 2. This article in the Social Democratic program is absolutely essential to the Social Democrats of Russia, A, for the sake of the basic principles of democracy in general, B, also because there are, within the frontiers of Russia, and what is more, in her frontier areas, a number of nations with sharply distinctive economic, social, and other conditions. Furthermore, these nations, like all the nations of Russia except the Great Russians, are unbelievably oppressed by the Tsarist monarchy. C, lastly, also in view of the fact that throughout Eastern Europe, Austria, and the Balkans, and in Asia, i.e. in countries bordering on Russia, the bourgeois democratic reform of the state that has everywhere else in the world led in varying degree to the creation of independent national states, or states with the closest interrelated national composition, has either not been consummated or has only just begun. D, at the present moment, Russia is a country whose state system is more backward and reactionary than that of any of the contiguous countries, beginning in the West with Austria, where the fundamentals of political liberty and a constitutional regime were consolidated in 1867, and where universal franchise has now been introduced, and ending in the East with Republican China. In all their propaganda, therefore, the Social Democrats of Russia must insist on the right of all nationalities to form separate states or to choose freely the state of which they wish to form part. Point 3. The Social Democratic Party's recognition of the right of all nationalities to self-determination requires of Social Democrats that they should, A, be unconditionally hostile to the use of force in any form whatsoever by the dominant nation, or the nation which constitutes the majority of the population, in respect of a nation that wishes to secede politically. B, demand the settlement of the question of such secession only on the basis of a universal, direct, and equal vote of the population of the given territory by secret ballot. C, conduct an implacable struggle against both the Black Hundred Octoberist and the liberal bourgeois, progressist, cadet, etc. parties on every occasion when they defend or sanction national oppression in general, or the denial of the rights of nations to self-determination in particular. Point 4. The Social Democratic Party's recognition of the right of all nationalities to self-determination most certainly does not mean that Social Democrats reject an independent appraisal of the advisability of the state secession of any nation in each separate case. Social democracy should, on the contrary, give its independent appraisal, taking into consideration the conditions of capitalist development, and the oppression of the proletarians of various nations by the united bourgeoisie of all nationalities, as well as the general tasks of democracy, first of all, and most of all, the interests of the proletarian class struggle for socialism. From this point of view, the following circumstance must be given special attention. There are two nations in Russia that are more civilized and more isolated by virtue of a number of historical and social conditions, and that could most easily and most, quote, naturally put into effect their right to secession. They are the peoples of Finland and Poland. The experience of the Revolution of 1905 has shown that even in these two nations, the ruling classes, the landowners and bourgeoisie, reject the revolutionary struggle for liberty and seek a rapprochement with the ruling classes of Russia and with the Tsarist monarchy because of their fear of the revolutionary proletariat of Finland and Poland. Social democracy therefore must give most emphatic warning to the proletariat and other working people of all nationalities against direct deception by the nationalist slogans of, quote, their own bourgeoisie, who with their saccharine or fiery speeches about our native land, try to divide the proletariat and divert its attention from their bourgeois intrigues while they enter into an economic and political alliance with the bourgeoisie of other nations and with the Tsarist monarchy. The proletariat cannot pursue its struggles for socialism and defend its everyday economic interests without the closest and fullest alliance of the workers of all nations in all working class organizations without exception. The proletariat cannot achieve freedom other than by revolutionary struggle for the overthrow of the Tsarist monarchy and its replacement by a democratic republic. The Tsarist monarchy precludes liberty and equal rights for nationalities, and is furthermore the bulwark of barbarity, brutality, and reaction in both Europe and Asia. This monarchy can be overthrown only by the united proletariat of all the nations of Russia, which is giving the lead to consistently democratic elements capable of revolutionary struggle from among the working masses of all nations. It follows, therefore, that workers who place political unity with, quote, their own bourgeoisie of their own nation above complete unity with the proletariat of all nations are acting against their own interests, against the interests of socialism and against the interests of democracy. Point 5. Social democrats, in upholding a consistently democratic state system, demand unconditional equality for all nationalities and struggle against absolutely all privileges for one or several nationalities. Quick comment here from S4A. When Lenin says social democrats, this is the old school pre-Russian Revolution word for communists, basically, Marxists, socialists of the hardcore air quotes type, not social democrats as we understand that term today, which means more welfare capitalists. Social democrats used to mean Marxist communist. All right, back to the text. In particular, social democrats reject a state or official language of the state. It is particularly superfluous in Russia because more than 7/10 of the population of Russia belong to related Slav nationalities who, given a free school and a free state, could easily achieve intercourse by virtue of the demands of the economic turnover without any state privileges for any one language. Social democrats demand the abolition of the old administrative divisions of Russia established by the feudal landowners and the civil servants of the autocratic feudal state, and their replacement by divisions based on the requirements of present-day economic life, and in accordance, as far as possible, with the national composition of the population. All areas of the state that are distinguished by social peculiarities, or by the national composition of the population, must enjoy wide self-government and autonomy, with institutions organized on the basis of universal, equal, and secret voting. Point 6. Social democrats demand the promulgation of a law, operative throughout the state, protecting the rights of every national minority in no matter what part of the state. This law should declare inoperative any measure by means of which the national majority might attempt to establish privileges for itself or restrict the rights of a national minority in the sphere of education, in the use of any specific language, in budget affairs, etc., and forbid the implementation of any such measure by making it a punishable offense. Point 7. the social democratic attitude to the slogan of cultural national, or simply national, autonomy, or to plans for its implementation is a negative one, since this slogan, 1, undoubtedly contradicts the internationalism of the class struggle of the proletariat, 2, makes it easier for the proletariat and the masses of people to be drawn into the sphere of influence of bourgeois nationalism, and 3, is capable of distracting attention from the task of the consistent democratic transformation of the state as a whole, which transformation alone can ensure, to the extent that this can in general be ensured under capitalism, peace between nationalities. In view of the special acuteness of the question of cultural national autonomy among social democrats, we give some explanation of the situation. A, it is impermissible, from the standpoint of social democracy, to issue the slogan of national culture either directly or indirectly. The slogan is incorrect because already under capitalism, all economic, political, and spiritual life is becoming more and more international. Socialism will make it completely international. International culture, which is now already being systematically created by the proletariat of all countries, does not absorb national culture, no matter of what national group, as a whole, but accepts from each national culture exclusively those of its elements that are consistently democratic and socialist. B, probably the one example of an approximation, even though it's a timid one, to the slogan of national culture and social democratic programs is Article 3 of the Brunn program of the Austrian Social Democrats. This Article 3 reads, all self-governing regions of one and the same nation form a single national alliance that has complete autonomy in deciding its national affairs. This is a compromise slogan because it does not contain a shadow of extraterritorial or personal national autonomy. But this slogan, too, is erroneous and harmful, for it is no business of the Social Democrats of Russia to unite into one nation with the Germans in Lodz, Riga, St. Petersburg, and Saratov. Our business is to struggle for full democracy and the annulment of all national privileges, and to unite the German workers in Russia with the workers of all other nations in upholding and developing the international culture of socialism. Still more erroneous is the slogan of extraterritorial, personal national autonomy with the setting up, according to a plan drawn up by the consistent supporters of this slogan, of national parliaments and national state secretaries, Otto Bauer and Karl Renner. Such institutions contradict the economic conditions of the capitalist countries. They have not been tested in any of the world's democratic states, and are the opportunist dream of people who despair of setting up consistent democratic institutions and are seeking salvation from the national squabbles of the bourgeoisie in the artificial isolation of the proletariat and the bourgeoisie of each nation on a number of cultural questions. Circumstances occasionally compel social democrats to submit for a time to some sort of compromise decisions, but from other countries we must borrow not compromise decisions, but consistently social democratic decisions. It would be particularly unwise to adopt the unhappy Austrian compromise decision today when it has been a complete failure in Austria and has led to the separatism and secession of the Czech Social Democrats. C. The history of the cultural national autonomy slogan in Russia shows that it has been adopted by all Jewish bourgeois parties and only by Jewish bourgeois parties, and that they have been uncritically followed by the Bund, which has inconsistently rejected the National Jewish Parliament, Sejm, and National Jewish State Secretaries. Incidentally, even those European social democrats who accede to or defend the compromise slogan of cultural national autonomy admit that the slogan is quite unrealizable for the Jews, Otto Bauer and Karl Kautsky. Quote, the Jews in Galicia and Russia are more of a caste than a nation, and attempts to constitute Jewry as a nation are attempts at preserving a caste, unquote, Karl Kautsky. D. In civilized countries, we observe a fairly full, relatively, approximation to national peace under capitalism only in conditions of the maximum implementation of democracy throughout the state system and administration, such as in Switzerland. The slogans of consistent democracy, the republic, militia, civil servants elected by the people, etc., unite the proletariat and the working people, and in general, all progressive elements in each nation in the name of the struggle for conditions that preclude even the slightest national privilege, while the slogan of cultural national autonomy preaches the isolation of nations in educational affairs, or cultural affairs in general, an isolation that is quite compatible with the retention of the grounds for all, including national privileges. The slogans of consistent democracy unite in a single whole the proletariat and the advanced democrats of all nations, elements that demand not isolation but the uniting of democratic elements of the nations in all matters, including educational affairs, while the slogan of cultural national autonomy divides the proletariat of the different nations and links it up with the reactionary and bourgeois elements of the separate nations. The slogans of consistent democracy are implacably hostile to the reactionaries and to the counter-revolutionary bourgeoisie of all nations, while the slogan of cultural national autonomy is quite acceptable to the reactionaries and counter-revolutionary bourgeoisie of some nations. Point 8. The sum total of economic and political conditions in Russia therefore demands that social democracy should unite unconditionally workers of all nationalities in all proletarian organizations without exception, political, trade union, cooperative, educational, etc., etc. The party should not be federative in structure and should not form national social democratic groups, but should unite the proletarians of all nations in the given locality, conduct propaganda and agitation in all the languages of the local proletariat, promote the common struggle of the workers of all nations against every kind of national privilege, and should recognize the autonomy of local and regional party organizations. Point 9. More than 10 years' experience gained by the RSDLP, Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, confirms the correctness of the above thesis. The party was founded in 1898 as a party of all Russia, that is, a party of the proletariat of all the nationalities of Russia. The party remained Russian when the Bund seceded in 1903, after the party Congress had rejected the demand to consider the Bund the only representative of the Jewish proletariat. In 1906 and 1907, events showed convincingly that there were no grounds for this demand. A large number of Jewish proletarians continued to cooperate in the common social democratic work in many local organizations, and the Bund re-entered the party. The Stockholm Congress, 1906, brought into the party the Polish and Latvian Social Democrats, who favored territorial autonomy, and the Congress, furthermore, did not accept the principle of federation and demanded unity of social democrats of all nationalities in each locality. This principle has been in operation in the Caucasus for many years. It is in operation in Warsaw, Polish workers and Russian soldiers, in Vilna, Polish, Lettish, Jewish, and Lithuanian workers, and in Riga, and in the three last named places it has been implemented against the separatist Bund. In December 1908, the RSDLP, through its conference, adopted a special resolution confirming the demand for the unity of workers of all nationalities on a principle other than federation. The splitting activities of the Bund separatists in not fulfilling the party decision led to the collapse of all that, quote, federation of the worst type, and brought about the rapprochement of the Bund and the Czech separatists and vice versa. And lastly, at the August 1912 Conference of the Liquidators, it led to an undercover attempt by the Bund separatists and liquidators, and some of the Caucasian liquidators, to insert their cultural national autonomy into the party program without any defense of its substance. Revolutionary worker social democrats in Poland, in the Latvian area, and in the Caucasus still stand for territorial autonomy and the unity of worker social democrats of all nations. The Bund liquidator secession and the alliance of the Bund with non-social democrats in Warsaw place the entire national question, both in its theoretical aspect and in the matter of party structure, on the order of the day for all social democrats. Compromise decisions have been broken by the very people who introduced them against the will of the party, and the demand for the unity of worker social democrats of all nationalities is being made more loudly than ever. Point 10. The crudely militant and Black Hundred type nationalism of the Tsarist monarchy, and also the revival of bourgeois nationalism, Great Russian, Mr. Struve, Ruskaya Mova, the Progressists, etc., the Ukrainian and Polish, the anti-Semitism of Narodowa Demokratia, and Georgian and Armenian, etc. All this makes it particularly urgent for social democratic organizations in all parts of Russia to devote greater attention than before to the national question and to work out consistently Marxist decisions on this subject in the spirit of consistent internationalism and unity of proletarians of all nations. So that is the end of the main text. There are a number of footnotes. Unfortunately, the way that this document was transcribed, it's using some Greek letters to mark notes in the text that unfortunately they're not actually bound to the text, so I'm not sure what they're referring to, and I will skip those except for ones that are complete sentences. So the first one is, the slogan of national culture is incorrect and expresses only the limited bourgeois understanding of the national question. Lenin instead asserts international culture. Another one is, the despair of the petty bourgeois, hopeless struggle against national bickering, and the fear of radical democratic reforms and the socialist movement. Only radical democratic reforms can establish national peace in capitalist states, and only socialism is able to terminate national bickering. There are a few final footnotes from Marxist.org here. First, these theses were written by Lenin for his lectures on the national question delivered on July 9, 10, 11, and 13, 1913 in the Swiss towns of Zurich, Geneva, Lausanne, and Bern. Second, the decisions of the Prague Conference, 1912, called the relations that the National Social Democratic Organizations had with the RSDLP from 1907 to 1911, quote, federation of the worst type. That's where that quote comes from. Although the social democratic organizations of Poland, Lithuania, and the Latvian area, and also the Bund, belonged to the RSDLP, they actually held themselves aloof. Their representatives did not take part in guiding all Russia party work. Directly or indirectly, they promoted the anti-party activities of the liquidators. Also, Russkaya Molva, or Russian Tidings, was a bourgeois daily organ of the Progressists, founded in 1912. Lenin called the Progressists a mixture of Octobrists and cadets. The paper appeared in St. Petersburg in 1912 and 1913. Narodowa Demokratia, hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, Polish, National Democracy, was a reactionary chauvinist party of the Polish bourgeoisie founded in 1897. Afraid of the growing revolutionary movement, the party changed its original demand for Polish independence to one for limited autonomy within the framework of the autocracy. During the 1905 to 1907 revolution, Narodowa Demokracja was the main party of Polish counter-revolution, the Polish Black Hundreds, to use Lenin's expression. They supported the Octobrists in the State Duma. In 1919, the party changed its name to, here we go, Związek Ludowo Narodowy, National Popular Union. Sorry, I don't speak any Polish, so I'm not sure how to pronounce that. And from 1928, it became the Stronnictwo Narodowe, National Party. Sure, that one was wrong. I'm sure someone who speaks Polish is laughing right now. After the Second World War, individuals from this party, having no longer any party of their own, attached themselves to Mikołajczyk's reactionary party, the Polska Stronnictwo Ludowe, Polish Popular Party. Okay. Thankfully, I think the Polish is over, at least for me. So that is the end of the document as a whole. I would like to add one more thing, and then you'll see where I'm going at the very end. This is another very much shorter audiobook, very brief audiobook. This is Lenin to Molotov. It's a letter, the Black Hundreds anti-clerical campaign from 19 March 1922. Again, this is hosted at Marxists.org. Copy to Comrade Molotov. Top secret for members of the Politburo. Please make no copies for any reason. Each member of the Politburo, including Comrade Kalinin, should comment directly on the document. Lenin. In regard to the occurrence at Shwia, which is already slated for discussion by the Politburo, it is necessary right now to make a firm decision about a general plan of action in the present course, because I doubt that I will be able to attend the Politburo meeting on March 20th in person. I will set down my thoughts in writing. The event at Shwia should be connected with the announcement that the Russian news agency, Rost, recently sent to the newspapers, but that was not for publication, namely the announcement that the Black Hundreds in Petrograd were preparing to defy the decree on the removal of property of value from the churches. If this fact is compared with what the papers report about the attitude of the clergy to the decree on the removal of church property, in addition to what we know about the illegal proclamation of Patriarch Tikhon, then it becomes perfectly clear that the Black Hundreds clergy, headed by its leader, with full deliberation, is carrying out a plan at this very moment to destroy us decisively. It is obvious that the most influential group of the Black Hundreds clergy conceived this plan in secret meetings, and that it was accepted with sufficient resolution. The events in Shuya is only one manifestation and actualization of this general plan. I think here that our opponent, and let me just comment here as S4A, who are the Black Hundreds? Why am I referencing this again? You may remember that the Black Hundreds were referenced in the last document on the national question. The Black Hundreds were extreme reactionaries in Russia and Eastern Europe. They were monarchists. They would be something like the neo-feudalist libertarians of today, except maybe even more extreme. It has come up a few times in the whole discussion about right-wingers apparently LARPing as Marxist-Leninists that has become sort of a growing issue of concern, particularly in various ways. But one of the forms that is taking is this embrace of libertarian militias, the Boogaloo Boys. I know the Boogaloo Boys is a little bit of a big tent. I mean, it's not really that big tent, honestly. The vast majority of it is libertarians being an extreme reactionary party, bourgeois party, founded in the 1970s by the US capitalist class for the sole purpose of trying to launch neoliberalism. The thing that we're all, even social democrats and, non-Marxists are like trying to go back to the golden age of the New Deal. Well, yeah, that thing. So it's come up in discussions around this in the more of the socialist online sphere of, we should work with these people. And it's come up that, Lenin advocated working with these people. Yeah, I'm not really hearing it in here. So bearing that in mind, let's continue here. It is obvious that the most influential group of the Black Hundreds clergy conceived this plan in secret meetings, and that it was accepted with sufficient resolution. The events in Shuya is only one manifestation and actualization of this general plan. I think that here our opponent is making a huge strategic error. Our opponent is making a huge strategic error by attempting to draw us into a decisive struggle now, when it is especially hopeless and especially disadvantageous to him. For us, on the other hand, precisely at the present moment, we are presented with an exceptionally favorable, even unique opportunity, when we can, in 99 out of 100 chances, utterly defeat our enemy with complete success and guarantee for ourselves the position we require for decades. Now and only now, when people are being eaten in famine-stricken areas, and hundreds, if not thousands, of corpses lie on the roads, we can and therefore must pursue the removal of church property with the most frenzied and ruthless energy, and not hesitate to put down the least opposition. Now and only now, the vast majority of peasants will either be on our side, or at least will not be in a position to support to any decisive degree this handful of Black Hundreds clergy and reactionary urban petty bourgeoisie who are willing and able to attempt to oppose the Soviet decree with a policy of force. We must pursue the removal of church property by any means necessary in order to secure for ourselves a fund of several 100 million gold rubles. Do not forget the immense wealth of some monasteries and loras. Without this fund, any government work in general, any economic buildup in particular, and any upholding of Soviet principles in Genoa especially is completely unthinkable. In order to get our hands on this fund of several 100 million gold rubles, and perhaps even several 100 billion, we must do whatever is necessary. But to do this successfully is possible only now. All considerations indicate that later on we will fail to do this, for no other time, besides that of desperate famine, will give us such a mood among the general mass of peasants that would ensure us the sympathy of this group, or at least would ensure us the neutralization of this group in the sense that victory in the struggle for the removal of church property unquestionably and completely will be on our side. One clever writer on statecraft correctly said that if it is necessary for the realization of a well-known political goal to perform a series of brutal actions, then it is necessary to do them in the most energetic manner and in the shortest time, because masses of people will not tolerate the protracted use of brutality. This observation in particular is further strengthened because harsh measures against a reactionary clergy will be politically impractical, possibly even extremely dangerous, as a result of the international situation in which we in Russia, in all probability, will find ourselves, or may find ourselves, after Genoa. Now, victory over the reactionary clergy is assured us completely. In addition, it will be more difficult for the major part of our foreign adversaries among the Russian emigres abroad, i.e. the socialist revolutionaries and the Milyukovites, left-wing cadet party, to fight against us if we, precisely at this time, precisely in connection with the famine, suppress the reactionary clergy with utmost haste and ruthlessness. Therefore, I come to the indisputable conclusion that we must precisely now smash the Black Hundred's clergy most decisively and ruthlessly, and put down all resistance with such brutality that they will not forget it for several decades. The campaign itself for carrying out this plan I envision in the following manner. Only Comrade Kalinin should appear officially in regard to any measures taken. Never and under no circumstance must Comrade Trotsky write anything for the press or in any other way appear before the public. The telegram already issued in the name of the Politburo about the temporary suspension of removals must not be rescinded. It is useful for us because it gives our adversary the impression that we are vacillating, that he has succeeded in confusing us. Our adversary, of course, will quickly find out about the secret telegram precisely because it is secret. Send to Shuya one of the most energetic, clear-headed, and capable members of the All-Russian Central Executive Committee, or some other representative of the central government. One is better than several. Giving him verbal instructions through one of the members of the Politburo. The instructions must come down to this, that in Shuya he must arrest more if possible, but not less than several dozen representatives of the local clergy, the local petty bourgeoisie, and the local bourgeoisie on suspicion of direct or indirect participation in the forcible resistance to the decree of the VTSIK, that is the All-Russia Central Committee, on the removal of property of value from churches. Immediately upon completion of this task, he must return to Moscow and personally deliver a report to the full session of the Politburo or to two specially authorized members of the Politburo. On the basis of this report, the Politburo will give a detailed directive to the judicial authorities, also verbal, that the trial of the insurrectionists from Shuya for opposing aid to the starving should be carried out in utmost haste and should end not other than with the shooting of the very largest number of the most influential and dangerous of the Black Hundreds in Shuya, and if possible, not only in the city, but even in Moscow and several other ecclesiastical centers. I think that it is advisable for us not to touch Patriarch Tikhon himself, even though he undoubtedly headed this whole revolt of slaveholders. Concerning him, the State Political Administration, GPU, must be given a secret directive that precisely at this time, all communications of this personage must be monitored and their contents disclosed in all possible accuracy and detail. Require Dzerzhinsky and Unschlicht personally to report to the Politburo about this weekly. At the Party Congress, arrange a secret meeting of all or almost all delegates to discuss this matter jointly with the chief workers of the GPU, the People's Commissariat of Justice, NKIU, and the Revolutionary Tribunal. At this meeting, pass a secret resolution of the Congress that the removal of property of value, especially from the very richest loras, monasteries, and churches, must be carried out with ruthless resolution, leaving nothing in doubt, and in the very shortest time. The greater the number of representatives of the reactionary clergy and the reactionary bourgeoisie that we succeed in shooting on this occasion, the better, because this audience must precisely now be taught a lesson in such a way that they will not dare to think about any resistance whatsoever for several decades. To attend to the quickest and most successful carrying out of these measures, there at the Congress, i.e. at the secret meeting, appoint a special commission, the participation of Comrade Trotsky and Comrade Kalinin being required, without giving any publicity to this commission, with the purpose that the subordination to it of all operations would be provided for and carried out, not in the name of the commission, but as an all-Soviet and all-party order. Appoint those who are especially responsible from among the best workers to carry out these measures in the wealthiest loras, monasteries, and churches. Lenin, March 19, 1922. A couple of additions. I request that Comrade Molotov attempt to circulate this letter to the members of the Politburo by evening today, not making copies, and ask them to return it to the Secretary immediately after reading it, with a succinct note regarding whether each member of the Politburo agrees in principle or if the letter arouses any differences of opinion. Lenin. And there's a note in the hand of Comrade Molotov, agreed. However, I propose to extend the campaign not to all gubernias and cities, but to those where indeed there are considerable possessions of value, accordingly concentrating the forces and attention of the party, March 19, Molotov, and that's the end of the document. So, both of the, and by the way, this is, especially would seem Machiavellian strategy and directive on Lenin's part. Keep in mind, 1922, this is the end of the Russian Civil War that began in 1917 with the revolution. They want it to end, they want a decisive victory, and they want to expropriate the wealth from the reactionary churches for the cause of the revolution. That is where this is coming from. So the Black Hundreds, as I mentioned, extreme pro-monarchist, pro-czar, reactionary forces. How did this work out in the case of Russia? We had one writing from before the revolution in 1913, in which Lenin said, we need to oppose them. What was the exact word he used? Implacably, conduct an implacable struggle against the Black Hundred Octoberist and the liberal bourgeois parties on every occasion when they defend or sanction national oppression in general or the denial of the right of nations to self-determination in particular. So I don't mean to necessarily sweep over the other interesting components of either of these documents. However, at this particular time in early 2021, we here on the channel have done a number of videos regarding the notion of a left-right alliance. I'm also going to come out and name a little bit more clearly. There seems to me to be a trend of people who basically have right-wing thinking claiming to take up Marxism. I'm seeing more and more of this. No, I'm not an ultra-left, but I literally have seen on Twitter, for example, people using like Keck and MAGA and other, I'm not making this up, I actually took screenshots, I'll be putting them in a later video, actual profiles of people, using every right-wing shibboleth you can think of, every right-wing, slogan and, code word. Basically, claiming now to be communists. I think that this is yet another sign. These are, not communists, obviously. This is another sign that the ruling class is terrified of the rising specter of communism all around us. As neoliberalism goes into its 5th decade here, the austerity, the hardship that they are bringing on people is creating real resistance. And there is a need by the ruling class, the bourgeoisie, the capitalists, to throw every kind of monkey wrench, direct assault, subtle assault that they possibly can at us. This whole notion of a, left-right populist, populism in general went out really with the rise of, in the 20th century, with the rise of like socialism being, kind of a household word in the United States, for example. Populism was a little more defensible before extensive proletarianization had begun, when there was still more of an agrarian economy. That hasn't been the case for a long time. People still clinging to populism now tend to be anti-socialist. So this idea that rather than building the Marxist movement, we should be embracing populism instead, that basically amounts to abandoning Marxism is what that is. Very much unlike Lenin's position in this, the second document from 1922, he says we need to strike now and strike hard because the enemy for some reason is picking a fight with us when we're at our strongest. Well, that's not the case with us today. The Marxist left is not very strong right now. We need to focus on building our strength rather than trying to, enter into allegiances with people who are basically our equivalent of the Black Hundreds. These reprehensibly reactionary, working class, mass forces that really have none of our political goals in line, and the ones that they claim to have, they're deliberately trying to deceive us. We're not anti-establishment, we're anti-capitalist. It's a completely different thing. Their whole concept of what's going on politically is different. We don't even, view politics as just politics. It's the government is one institution within the overall framework of capitalism. The entire thing is just different. Hey, can you peel off a few people and build the Marxist movement? Yeah, that's actually exactly what I'm trying to suggest here. What I'm trying to resist is just forming an open-ended, all-purposes alliance, basically with our equivalent of the Black Hundreds, because guess what? They're stronger right now. They're going to take over our movement, and just strategically, absolutely a terrible idea. And frankly, I'm looking at this more and more as a kind of bourgeois and petty bourgeois attempted sabotage of the socialist movement, the Marxist movement in the United States, which is small and long has been small. But we're trying to build it, and this is not a step towards building it. We get mad at people who sell us out, pretending to be leftists when they're not. People like AOC, for example, people like Bernie Sanders, who, it would appear they use some of the same phrases, etc., but then they just, side with the capitalists in the end. Well, why would you openly embrace people who, their stated goals are, they might claim to be, quote, anti-establishment. They just want to be the slaveholders themselves. Anyway, it's just bizarre. It's just bizarre. But anyway, 2 documents where Lenin is talking about the Black Hundreds. What do you think? Did I miss anything major here? Do you have other works you'd like me to review of Lenin talking about dealing with reactionaries? And by which I don't mean labor unionists who weren't Bolsheviks, okay? Because even a regular labor unionist, is way to the left of, say, a libertarian who doesn't even believe society exists. They just believe in individuals. They think that by talking about racism, you're a racist. It's so incredibly backwards and reactionary and just contrarian. We as Marxists, we're going for scientific socialism. We're looking for a scientific outlook. These people are irrationalists. It's like their entire worldview, politically and socially, and in every other related way, is a steaming mass of contradictions that is incomprehensible. It's just basically the fury of the bourgeoisie, and enlisting some of the aspiring petty bourgeoisie into their ranks. This would be bad for workers. It's bad for us. Marxists shouldn't support it, especially now when we're not all that strong. We're still building our numbers. What are you even thinking? But I hear this coming out of, particularly, I don't watch Caleb Maupin. I don't really have a reason to, but one of Caleb Maupin's viewers contacted me. That was part of what kicked us off, was that Caleb was apparently telling his viewers, where I see a lot of this right-wing bullshit coming out of. Down to just flat-out fascists. I saw Caleb interacting in his comments, neutrally, with a commenter called Traditional Fascist was the username. Just, casually asking a few questions. If somebody named Traditional Fascist tried commenting on this account, I would delete it. Are you kidding me? But, when you run a channel where you're not only tolerating that kind of stuff, just letting it be, but actually interacting with it in a way that is at least neutral. Well, what's that saying that if you have one Nazi at a table and 9 other people, if the 9 other people aren't taking direct measures against that person's Nazism but tolerating it, then you effectively have 10 Nazis at that table? Yeah, that's a standard we should hold, actually. It's a specifically in the context of just tolerating these people, not converting them or not challenging them, but just shaking hands with them and saying, we both want the same things. Well, no, we fucking don't. If you think that, you're not a socialist. I'm sorry, you're not. So you should go and reevaluate that. But this whole right-wing tainting of the socialist movement, by which I mean some pretty far-right influences, actually, not just mere liberal opportunism, but like reactionary. It goes beyond opportunism. But like actual reactionary influence. This has to be addressed, and we'll be doing more videos on that in the near future. Thanks for listening, and we're going to catch you in the next video. And that's the video. Thanks to our current patrons whose names are on the screen. If you'd like to get your name on the screen or just support us financially, you can go to patreon.com/socialismforall and sign up for a monthly donation. You can also follow us at facebook.com/socialism4all. Used to have a page at FOR all, and it got throttled to death by Zuck. Here on YouTube, please click the like button, subscribe button, and the notifications bell. Please leave a comment if you can, and please share our video wherever you're online, your Twitter feed, your Discord servers, Reddit subs, etc. All of that helps more people to see this content, whether it's in the YouTube algorithm or just posting it on other sites. All of that's helpful. All of you out there supporting and promoting this content makes it all go that much more smoothly. We need to end capitalism, normalize talking about socialism today, and it's really kind of our only hope for a better tomorrow. Thanks for all you do, and we will catch you in the next video. Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. Today's date is November 29, 2020, and this is an audiobook of The Historical Destiny of the Doctrine of Karl Marx by Vladimir Lenin. This audiobook is part of the 26-part series Basic Marxism-Leninism Study Course. You can find that playlist on our channel, and that curriculum was originally put out by the MAI, Anti-Imperialist Movement. So this essay was originally published in Pravda number 50, March 1, 1913, signed VI, and published here according to that Pravda text. The source is Lenin Collected Works, Progress Publishers, 1975, Moscow, Volume 18. Translated by Stepan Apresian, transcription by Zodiac, HTML by Brian Baggins and D. Walters, and it's in the public domain, Lenin Internet Archive, 1996. Thanks, as usual, to Marxists Internet Archive, Marxists.org, which hosts this for free. Please go check out their site. They have thousands of Marxist texts for free online. Now into the audiobook. The chief thing in the doctrine of Marx is that it brings out the historic role of the proletariat as the builder of socialist society. Has the course of events all over the world confirmed this doctrine since it was expounded by Marx? Marx first advanced it in 1844. The Communist Manifesto of Marx and Engels, published in 1848, gave an integral and systematic exposition of this doctrine, an exposition which has remained the best to this day. Since then, world history has been clearly divided into three main periods. One, from the Revolution of 1848 to the Paris Commune, 1871. Two, from the Paris Commune to the Russian Revolution, 1905. Three, since the Russian Revolution. Let us see what has been the destiny of Marx's doctrine in each of these periods. 1. At the beginning of the first period, Marx's doctrine by no means dominated. It was only one of the very numerous groups or trends of socialism. The forms of socialism that did dominate were in the main akin to our narrotism, in comprehension of the materialist basis of historical movement, inability to single out the role and significance of each class in capitalist society, concealment of the bourgeois nature of democratic reforms under diverse quasi-socialist phrases about the people, justice, right, and so on. The Revolution of 1848 struck a deadly blow at all these vociferous, motley, and ostentatious forms of pre-Marxian socialism. In all countries, the revolution revealed the various classes of society in action. The shooting of the workers by the Republican bourgeoisie in Paris in the June days of 1848 finally revealed that the proletariat alone was socialist by nature. The liberal bourgeoisie dreaded the independence of this class 100 times more than it did any kind of reaction. The craven liberals groveled before reaction. The peasantry were content with the abolition of the survivals of feudalism and joined the supporters of order, wavering but occasionally between workers' democracy and bourgeois liberalism. All doctrines of non-class socialism and non-class politics proved to be sheer nonsense. The Paris Commune, 1871, completed this development of bourgeois changes. The Republic, i.e. the form of political organization in which class relations appear in their most unconcealed form, owed its consolidation solely to the heroism of the proletariat. In all the other European countries, a more tangled and less complete development led to the same result, a bourgeois society that had taken definite shape. Towards the end of the first period, 1848 to 71, a period of storms and revolutions, pre-Marxian socialism was dead. Independent proletarian parties came into being, the First International, 1864 to 72, and the German Social Democratic Party. 2. The second period, 1872 to 1904, was distinguished from the first by its, quote, peaceful character, by the absence of revolutions. The West had finished with bourgeois revolutions. The East had not yet risen to them. The West entered a phase of, quote, peaceful preparations for the changes to come. Socialist parties, basically proletarian, were formed everywhere and learned to use bourgeois parliamentarism and to found their own daily press, their educational institutions, their trade unions, and their cooperative societies. Marx's doctrine gained a complete victory and began to spread. The selection and mustering of the forces of the proletariat and its preparation for the coming battles made slow but steady progress. The dialectics of history were such that the theoretical victory of Marxism compelled its enemies to disguise themselves as Marxists. Liberalism, rotten within, tried to revive itself in the form of socialist opportunism. They interpreted the period of preparing the forces for great battles as renunciation of these battles. Improvement of the conditions of the slaves to fight against wage slavery, they took to mean the sale by the slaves of their right to liberty for a few pence. They cravenly preached, quote, social peace, i.e. peace with the slave owners, renunciation of the class struggle, etc. They had very many adherents among socialist members of parliament, various officials of the working class movement, and the, quote, sympathizing intelligentsia. 3. However, the opportunists had scarcely congratulated themselves on, quote, social peace and on the non-necessity of storms under, quote, democracy, when a new source of great world storms opened up in Asia. The Russian Revolution was followed by revolutions in Turkey, Persia, and China. It is in this era of storms and their, quote, repercussions in Europe that we are now living. No matter what the fate of the great Chinese Republic, against which various, quote, civilized hyenas are now whetting their teeth, no power on earth can restore the old serfdom in Asia or wipe out the heroic democracy of the masses in the Asiatic and semi-Asiatic countries. Certain people who were inattentive to the conditions for preparing and developing the mass struggle were driven to despair and to anarchism by the lengthy delays in the decisive struggle against capitalism in Europe. We can now see how short-sighted and faint-hearted this anarchist despair is. The fact that Asia, with its population of 800 million, has been drawn into the struggle for these same European ideals should inspire us with optimism and not despair. The Asiatic revolutions have again shown us the spinelessness and baseness of liberalism, the exceptional importance of the independence of the democratic masses, and the pronounced demarcation between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie of all kinds. After the experience both of Europe and Asia, anyone who speaks of non-class politics and non-class socialism ought simply to be put in a cage and exhibited alongside the Australian kangaroo or something like that. After Asia, Europe has also begun to stir, although not in the Asiatic way. the quote, peaceful period of 1872 to 1904 has passed, never to return. The high cost of living and the tyranny of the trusts are leading to an unprecedented sharpening of the economic struggle, which has set into movement even the British workers who have been most corrupted by liberalism. We see a political crisis brewing even in the most, quote, diehard bourgeois junker country, Germany. The frenzied arming and the policy of imperialism are turning modern Europe into a, quote, social peace, which is more like a gunpowder barrel. Meanwhile, the decay of all the bourgeois parties and the maturing of the proletariat are making steady progress. Since the appearance of Marxism, each of the three great periods of world history has brought Marxism new confirmation and new triumph. But a still greater triumph awaits Marxism as the doctrine of the proletariat in this coming period of history. End of audiobook. So that was a quick one. Again, this is 1913, before, of course, the revolution of 1917 in Russia, and then the subsequent civil war, which led to the establishment of the socialist state, Soviet Russia, and the founding of the USSR. But there are a few things, just to comment quickly, that stand out to me in reading this in 2020. So one of the first ones was when Lenin talked about opportunism. So he wrote, "The dialectics of history were such that the theoretical victory of Marxism compelled its enemies to disguise themselves as Marxists. Liberalism, rotten within, tried to revive itself in the form of socialist opportunism." So in other words, Marxism had shown itself to many, many proletarians that it was correct. It was capable of predicting history, that its grasp on capitalism was strong and correct and, compelling, convincing. So the liberals, losing the ideological battle, had to basically pretend to be Marxists, but then they couldn't, of course, actually promote Marxism. They had to promote a watered-down, corrupted version of Marxism that, of course, would just lead the workers back into slavery. We see a massive trend toward this today. The rise of BreadTube. BreadTube is a little bit anarchist, but a lot of it is, social democrat or democratic socialist. I mean, the line is blurry between those two. And especially the radlib, the liberal who uses some amount of radical rhetoric to disguise their liberalism. So opportunism is basically when Marxists work with people who they shouldn't work with, people who have fundamental differences of class interest. In other words, it's working with liberals. You really can't do it. The liberals are going to sell you out. It's not really in their interest to work with you, except to deceive you, and that's all that they'll do. We have seen this, unfortunately, now twice with Bernie Sanders. I, here at Socialism for All, was willing to be part of the left wing of the Bernie Sanders coalition in an effort to try to propel, to do the opposite of this, actually, to attack liberalism from within one of these, class peace movements, to basically say, yes, we want change, and actually Bernie's not going far enough. The Squad and, most of the Justice Democrats who are trying to reform and rebuild the liberal wing of the Democratic Party while using socialist language, talking about FDR, who saved capitalism and was a social democrat, just a reformed capitalist, as some kind of socialist. This is not what we need. FDR is why we're having the 2020 we're having, because he saved capitalism with the class piece. So despite some recent comments by AOC that everything that she's tried to do in the Democratic Party hasn't worked, etc., that, basically the Democratic Party is a dead end, which I took as possibly, optimistic, or I viewed in an optimistic light as possibly good news, that, hey, maybe AOC is going to start telling people to dem exit, because that's really what we need people to do. You just can't work within a bourgeois party effectively as a socialist unless, the only thing you can really do there is to go in, as I was just talking about, and try to attack liberalism, but not to work with it. As, for example, the Squad just voted to make Nancy Pelosi, who has been starving Americans by, failing to pass emergency pandemic aid for months now, They just voted to make her House Speaker again. So opportunism, radlibery, Lenin was writing about it in 1913. This is what liberals do when socialism, actual Marxists, promoting actual socialism as we are, start to become more popular. They basically just claim that they are socialists and use their money to, basically drown us out in the media. So the other topic here in point 3, Lenin writes, however, the opportunists had scarcely congratulated themselves on, quote, social peace and on the non-necessity of storms under, quote, democracy, when a new source of great world storms opened up in Asia. So, in other words, what is the social peace? Class peace, class truce. This is basically when the capitalists, feeling that they are sufficiently threatened, decide to say, hey, let's draw up a truce. The New Deal in the mid-1930s in the United States is a great example of this. It's like, oh, we just had a decade of the Coal Wars in the 1920s, which was the largest conflict since the Civil War, which was basically people trying to resist, the invasion of the coal miners, capitalists uprooting people from the land in Appalachia, and just broad labor union activity all across the United States in the 1900s, 19-teens, 1920s. FDR's faction of the ruling class, and he was absolutely a one-percenter, said, let's throw these people a bone, we'll draw up a class peace, and then that will greatly diminish the threat of revolution. Now, capitalists, of course, at any time can do this. I mean, Lenin has pointed out in other works that it's actually incredibly cheap for capitalists to make some concessions. By just paying 0.5% of their wealth, they can buy off the working class with remarkable ease. The fact that they crushed Bernie Sanders as hard as they did, to me speaks to, both their, of course, extreme arrogance, but possibly also to their fear that at this point things are so unstable and it may actually be the end of the line for capitalism that they're almost afraid to make concessions now, fearing that people will just overrun them. That's entirely possible. That was basically my proposal as far as working within the Bernie Sanders movement, is that we use that to sort of get a leg up for actual socialism. Who knows? All I do know is that given the two options, option A being leave the people who are currently in power, the people who hate us, have a long history of systemic violence against us, who have diametrically opposed interests to us, and who have the power to basically retract and extend offers at will, and we have almost no counterpower against it. Leave them in power, but try to get a few concessions from them, versus option B, throw them out and we take power. Why would anyone really take option A? Of course, it might seem more daunting to do option B, but of course it's more desirable. Getting people to admit that, getting working people to admit that it is more desirable that we just take power, is clearly a positive first step. If you can get somebody to at least own that desire, that's key, and may lead to changes down the line. Which I guess leads me to my concluding point. Lenin talks about despair and delay leading to anarchism. Quote, certain people who were inattentive to the conditions for preparing and developing the mass struggle were driven to despair and to anarchism by the lengthy delays in the decisive struggle against capitalism in Europe. Now, here in 2020, there still haven't been any revolutions in the most advanced capitalist countries of Western Europe and North America. And a great deal of socialist-minded people have been driven to anarchism. I may be doing more of a response to anarchism video at some point. A viewer actually just recommended that I look at a video series called The State is Counter-Revolutionary by a channel called Anarch. I did start to watch it. It's a horrible series of videos in my opinion. It's very, very typical collection of mischaracterizations, misunderstandings, and probable, purposeful straw manning, deliberate misrepresentation of Marxist-Leninist viewpoints. But if an impatience with revolution combined with decades of anti-socialist propaganda, which unfortunately many anarchists haven't seemed to recognize as such, has driven as many people as it has in the West to anarchism. That's a thing that we really need to start to combat, and that's a reason I'm doing Socialism for All. I've thoroughly looked at anarchism, contemplated it, turned it over in my mind, and rejected it. There's just no way forward there. But again, that's a video for another time. This has been an audiobook of Lenin's Historical Destiny of the Doctrine of Karl Marx. Thanks to our current patrons for November 2020, whose names are on the screen. If you'd like to become a patron, you can do so at patreon.com/Socialism for All. We're also rebuilding the Facebook page at facebook.com/socialism, the number 4, all. Please like, subscribe, comment, all of that kind of stuff. And here on the channel on YouTube, hit that subscribe button and the notifications bell. Like, share, comment, spread it to your Discord groups, Reddit servers, and wherever else you're online. Thanks, and we'll see you in the next video. Hi, welcome to Socialism for All. This is not a regular podcast today, but an audiobook. We're going to be recording the 26 audiobooks in the basic study plan of the anti-imperialism movement, or MAI. So this is that organization's Marxism-Leninism basic study plan. It's intended for people who are interested in socialism, who want to branch out from left liberalism or wherever you're at politically today, and start reading some Marx, Engels, Lenin, and Mao to get more familiar with the core texts, the core theory, and history and philosophy behind the movement for socialism in the 20th and 21st centuries, as put forward by Marxism-Leninism, which was the central set of ideas behind many of the successful socialist efforts and socialist revolutions in the 20th century and on through to today. So as I said, this is a set of 26 texts. You can find a link to the entire curriculum in the video description below, or you can go to our page at facebook.com/Socialism for All, or you can go to the Patreon page at patreon.com/Socialism for All. Incidentally, if you can become a patron, you can sponsor for as little as $1 a month. All of those contributions allow us to build this organization, to put more time and effort into making these videos, to doing education, and to making socialist theory more accessible to people, so that you can bring yourself up to speed on what socialism is all about in really more of an advanced way than you can get through just memes and things like that. So today's text is by Lenin. This is, again, the first of 26. There are 3 texts in the section that MAI calls introductory texts. This one being Lenin's The 3 Sources and 3 Component Parts of Marxism. Also in the introductory set that we'll do in later videos, there is just Lenin writing on Karl Marx, and then Marx and Engels' Manifesto of the Communist Party. After this, there are other sections on historical materialism and other things. So if any of these terms, I have to also add, are unfamiliar to you, don't be intimidated. Grab a pen or pencil or a piece of paper or whatever you like to write with. If you hear any terms that you're not familiar with or names that you're not familiar with, just write them down and look them up. If you have questions, post the questions in the comments, or the comments in YouTube or wherever you're reading this, SoundCloud. I'll be posting this all over the place. So post it in the comments. You can always go to the Facebook page and post comments there as well, and we can have a discussion. That's what this is all about. People are students of Marxism-Leninism first, before you can really put any of these ideas into practice in the world. So, it is a study plan, and so expect to take notes, ask questions, do some side research, and we'll have a good discussion about it. All right, let's get into the text. So today's text, and the first of 26 in the basic study plan, is called The 3 Sources and 3 Component Parts of Marxism by Vladimir Ilyich Lenin. It was originally published in March of 1913. You can find this version at Marxist's Internet Archive, and I'll put a link to that in the description. Now the text begins. This article was published in 1913 in Prozveshchenia number 3, dedicated to the 30th anniversary of Marx's death. Prozveshchenia Enlightenment was a Bolshevik social, political, and literary monthly published legally in St. Petersburg from December 1911 onwards. Its inauguration was proposed by Lenin to replace the Bolshevik journal Misl, Thought, a Moscow publication banned by the Tsarist government. Lenin directed the work of the journal from abroad and wrote the following articles for it: Fundamental Problems of the Election Campaign, Results of the Election, Critical Remarks on the National Question, The Right of Nations to Self-Determination, and others. The journal was suppressed by the Tsarist government in June 1914 on the eve of the First World War. Publication was resumed in the autumn of 1917, but only one double number appeared. This number contained 2 articles by Lenin: Can the Bolsheviks Retain State Power? And a review of the party program. Throughout the civilized world, the teachings of Marx evoke the utmost hostility and hatred of all bourgeois science, both official and liberal, which regards Marxism as a kind of pernicious sect. And no other attitude is to be expected, for there can be no impartial social science in a society based on class struggle. In one way or another, all official and liberal science defends wage slavery, whereas Marxism has declared relentless war on that slavery. To expect science to be impartial in a wage-slave society is as foolishly naive as to expect impartiality from manufacturers on the question of whether workers' wages ought not to be increased by decreasing the profits of capital. But this is not all. The history of philosophy and the history of social science show with perfect clarity that there is nothing resembling sectarianism in Marxism, in the sense of its being a hidebound, petrified doctrine, a doctrine which arose away from the high road of the development of world civilization. On the contrary, the genius of Marx consists precisely in his having furnished answers to questions already raised by the foremost minds of mankind. His doctrine emerged as the direct and immediate continuation of the teachings of the greatest representatives of philosophy, political economy, and socialism. The Marxist doctrine is omnipotent because it is true. It is comprehensive and harmonious and provides men with an integral world outlook irreconcilable with any form of superstition, reaction, or defense of bourgeois oppression. It is the legitimate successor to the best that humans have produced in the 19th century, as represented by German philosophy, English political economy, and French socialism. It is these 3 sources of Marxism, which are also its component parts, that we shall outline in brief. Section 1. The philosophy of Marxism is materialism. Throughout the modern history of Europe, and especially at the end of the 18th century in France, where a resolute struggle was conducted against every kind of medieval rubbish, against serfdom in institutions and ideas, materialism has proved to be the only philosophy that is consistent, true to all the teachings of natural science and hostile to superstition, Kant, and so forth. The enemies of democracy have, therefore, always exerted all their efforts to refute, undermine, and defame materialism, and have advocated various forms of philosophical idealism, which always, in one way or another, amounts to the defense or support of religion. Marx and Engels defended philosophical materialism in the most determined manner, and repeatedly explained how profoundly erroneous is every deviation from this basis. Their views are most clearly and fully expounded in the works of Engels, Ludwig Feuerbach, and Anti-Düring, which, like the Communist Manifesto, are handbooks for every class-conscious worker. But Marx did not stop at 18th century materialism. He developed philosophy to a higher level. He enriched it with the achievements of German classical philosophy, especially of Hegel's system, which in its turn had led to the materialism of Feuerbach. The main achievement was dialectics, i.e. the doctrine of development in its fullest, deepest, and most comprehensive form. The doctrine of the relativity of the human knowledge that provides us with a reflection of eternally developing matter. The latest discoveries of natural science, radium, electrons, the transmutation of elements, have been a remarkable confirmation of Marx's dialectical materialism, despite the teachings of the bourgeois philosophers with their new reversions to old and decadent idealism. Marx deepened and developed philosophical materialism to the full and extended the cognition of nature to include the cognition of human society. His historical materialism was a great achievement in scientific thinking. The chaos and arbitrariness that had previously reigned in views on history and politics were replaced by a strikingly integral and harmonious scientific theory, which shows how, in consequence of the growth of productive forces, out of one system of social life, another and higher system develops, how capitalism, for instance, grows out of feudalism. Just as man's knowledge reflects nature, i.e. developing matter, which exists independently of him, so man's social knowledge, i.e. his various views and doctrines, philosophical, religious, political, and so forth, reflects the economic system of society. Political institutions are a superstructure on that economic foundation. We see, for example, that the various political forms of the modern European states serve to strengthen the domination of the bourgeoisie over the proletariat. Marx's philosophy is a consummate philosophical materialism, which has provided mankind, and especially the working class, with powerful instruments of knowledge. Section 2. Having recognized that the economic system is the foundation on which the political superstructure is erected, Marx devoted his greatest attention to the study of this economic system. Marx's principal work, Capital, is devoted to a study of the economic system of modern, i.e. capitalist, society. Classical political economy before Marx evolved in England, the most developed of the capitalist countries. Adam Smith and David Ricardo, by their investigations of the economic system, laid the foundations of the labor theory of value. Marx continued their work. He provided a proof of the theory and developed it consistently. He showed that the value of every commodity is determined by the quantity of socially necessary labor time spent on its production. Where the bourgeois economists saw a relation between things, the exchange of one commodity for another, Marx revealed a relation between people. The exchange of commodities expresses the connection between individual producers through the market. Money signifies that the connection is becoming closer and closer, inseparably uniting the entire economic life of the individual producers into one whole. Capital signifies a further development of this connection. Man's labor power becomes a commodity. The wage worker sells their labor power to the owner of land, factories, and instruments of labor. The worker spends one part of the day covering a cost of maintaining themselves and their family, wages, while the other part of the day, the worker works without remuneration, creating for the capitalist surplus value, the source of profit, the source of the wealth of the capitalist class. The doctrine of surplus value is the cornerstone of Marx's economic theory. Capital, created by the labor of the worker, crushes the worker, ruining small proprietors and creating an army of unemployed. In industry, the victory of large-scale production is immediately apparent, but the same phenomenon is also to be observed in agriculture, where the superiority of large-scale capitalist agriculture is enhanced, the use of machinery increases, and the peasant economy, trapped by money capital, declines and falls into ruin under the burden of its backward technique. The decline of small-scale production assumes different forms in agriculture, but the decline itself is an indisputable fact. By destroying small-scale production, capital leads to an increase in productivity of labor and to the creation of a monopoly position for the associations of big capitalists. Production itself becomes more and more social. Hundreds of thousands and millions of workers become bound together in a regular economic organism, but the product of this collective labor is appropriated by a handful of capitalists. Anarchy of production, crises, the furious chase after markets, and the insecurity of existence of the mass of the population are intensified. By increasing the dependence of the workers on capital, the capitalist system creates the great power of united labor. Marx traced the development of capitalism from embryonic commodity economy, from simple exchange to its highest forms, to large-scale production. And the experience of all capitalist countries, old and new, year by year, demonstrates clearly the truth of this Marxian doctrine to increasing numbers of workers. Capitalism has triumphed all over the world, but this triumph is only the prelude to the triumph of labor over capital. Section 3. When feudalism was overthrown and, quote, free capitalist society appeared in the world, it at once became apparent that this freedom meant a new system of oppression and exploitation of the working people. Various socialist doctrines immediately emerged as a reflection of and protest against this oppression. Early socialism, however, was utopian socialism. It criticized capitalist society, it condemned and damned it, it dreamed of its destruction, it had visions of a better order, and endeavored to convince the rich of the immorality of exploitation. But utopian socialism could not indicate the real solution. It could not explain the real nature of wage slavery under capitalism. It could not reveal the laws of capitalist development or show what social force is capable of becoming the creator of a new society. Meanwhile, the stormy revolutions which everywhere in Europe, and especially in France, accompanied the fall of feudalism, of serfdom, more and more clearly revealed the struggle of classes as the basis and the driving force of all development. Not a single victory of political freedom over the feudal class was won except against desperate resistance. Not a single capitalist country evolved on a more or less free and democratic basis except by a life and death struggle between the various classes of capitalist society. The genius of Marx lies in his having been the first to deduce from this lesson world history teaches, and to apply that lesson consistently. The deduction he made is the doctrine of the class struggle. People have always been the foolish victims of deception and self-deception in politics, and they always will be until they have learned to seek out the interests of some class or another behind all moral, religious, political, and social phrases, declarations, and promises. Champions of reforms and improvements will always be fooled by the defenders of the old order until they realize that every old institution, however barbarous and rotten it may appear to be, is kept going by the forces of certain ruling classes. And there is only one way of smashing the resistance of those classes, and that is to find, in the very society which surrounds us, the forces which can, and, owing to their social position, must, constitute the power capable of sweeping away the old and creating the new, and to enlighten and organize those forces for that struggle. Marx's philosophical materialism alone has shown the proletariat the way out of the spiritual slavery in which all oppressed classes have hitherto languished. Marx's economic theory alone has explained the true position of the proletariat in the general system of capitalism. Independent organizations of the proletariat are multiplying all over the world, from America to Japan and from Sweden to South Africa. The proletariat is becoming enlightened and educated by waging its class struggle. It is ridding itself of the prejudices of bourgeois society. It is rallying its ranks ever more closely and is learning to gauge the measure of its successes. It is steeling its forces, and it is growing irresistibly. And that is the end of The Three Sources and the Three Component Parts of Marxism by Vladimir Ilyich Lenin. That was again originally published in March of 1913. Credit to Marxists Internet Archive as the source. This is in the public domain now, and you can find more details on this particular edition at the link to that particular version of this text. But I think that this is such a powerful, brief document that introduces students to some of the most basic ideas about Marxism-Leninism and how it is distinct, as Lenin discusses in here, from utopian socialism. This kind of thing of like, we can identify capitalists, we can complain about it, but we don't really know what to do about it, or we'll cough up a bunch of ideas, but they may not go anywhere. Whereas Marxism-Leninism, as you will see in this set of 26 audiobooks, just cuts like a knife right through to class struggle, class interests, and really everything else just kind of lines up around that. And it's such a powerful guide for interpreting social struggle, political economy, and how to go forward. So thanks again for listening. I hope that you go on in this basic guide to Marxism-Leninism with audiobook 2, and I'll see you there. You can catch me again at facebook.com/socialismforall. Please become a patron at Patreon, patreon.com/socialismforall. You can sponsor for as little as $1 a month. Everything is appreciated. Also, just remember to like, share, subscribe. All of that boosts the channel and gets this to more people. Thanks very much. Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. Today's date is April 29, 2022. Yesterday, I put up on the channel a video titled, "What Did Lenin Think of Populism?" plus an audiobook and discussion of a Lenin text in memory of Herzen from 1912. This video was in direct response to something that the patriotic socialists say, which is that Marxists should embrace populism. This is something that you hear from CPI and Caleb Maupin and people like Infracell, Jackson Hinkle, Peter Coffin, all those chuds and jokes and other people who are basically alt-right pretending to be communist for one reason or another. Sometimes people call this revisionist or opportunist, and while it is those things, I think that those terms actually presume an amount of sincerity which is not present in the content coming out of those channels. In other words, in order to make a mistake, such as opportunist class collaboration, you have to be trying in the first place. Then, if you're making a genuine, sincere attempt and you fail, then okay, it was a mistake. If you correct it, then you can make progress again. But I think it goes beyond that. I do think that some of these people are specifically out to wreck. They're out to mislead people in the audience who are trying to learn this. And I think that people like Caleb Maupin in particular definitely know better. And they're making this choice of class collaboration and promoting populism, which Lenin explicitly rejected over and over and over again on purpose. So we made that point pretty clear in yesterday's video. What did Lenin think of populism? We're just to drive the point home a little bit more clearly for the slow learners and people just generally in denial or whatever the issue is. We're going to drive it home a little bit more clearly with another Lenin text on narratism. Narratism was populism in Lenin's time. The Narodniks is what they were called, and the Socialist Revolutionary Party was one instance of that. What was Lenin's response when the Socialist Revolutionary Party appeared on the scene in 1902? He wrote a piece titled, "Why the Social Democrats, meaning the Marxists, must declare a determined and relentless war on the Socialist Revolutionaries." Does not sound like he was particularly supportive of that tendency. Then you get Infracell the other night in a prominent Twitter space with like 1,200 listeners in it. When challenged on populism, he said, "I don't just mean populism like doing what's popular or appealing directly to the masses, not that kind of populism. I mean old school populism like Alexander Herzen, who was an influence on Lenin." So in the last video, we read Lenin's In Memory of Herzen, in which he praised Herzen, who was an early socialist and stopped short of historical materialism. He didn't embrace scientific socialism and therefore was confused, but he wasn't just a liberal, and that was kind of the point that Lenin was trying to make. I compared it to Martin Luther King, where liberals and conservatives are always trying to sort of just whitewash the history of some of Martin Luther King's more radical tendencies and paint him as a liberal or even a conservative, as Glenn Beck tried to do. So Lenin was like, this is not an example of politics that we would like to carry on today, because Herzen was the progenitor of narratism, which again extended into the Socialist Revolutionary Party, which Lenin said, no, declare war on those people. But he praised Herzen in his time for being revolutionary, and he didn't want Herzen's memory to go down as just a liberal, because he wasn't. But he wasn't also a Marxist, and Lenin said as much, and Lenin did not embrace those populist politics. He opposed them vigorously. So on that note, let's pick up with today's short audiobook on narratism. This is from January 20 and 22, 1913, by Lenin. It was originally printed in Pravda, numbers 16 and 17, published according to the Pravda text. Sources Lenin Collected Works, Progress Publishers, 1975, Moscow, volume 18. Translated by Stepan Apresian, HTML transcription and markup by R. Sambala, and it's in the public domain at the Lenin Internet Archive within the Marxists Internet Archive, marxists.org. Thanks as usual to MIA for hosting this and thousands of other free Marxist texts. Please go check them out, link in description. Let's get into the text. Mr. AVP, a pseudonym of A.V. Peshekhanov, one of the leaders of the Popular Socialist Party, has contributed to Roskoye Bogatstvo, number 12, a, quote, leading article on a, quote, current subject headed Socialism, Popular or Proletarian. The article is quite shallow and pointless in itself. It is quite a long time since we encountered in the, quote, leading articles of a Narodnik publication that considers itself important such a meaningless set of words, such a spate of evasive, bald phrases, or such a hodgepodge of eclectic views. But the characteristic thing about the article is that it raises the highly important and topical question of the disintegration of Narodism. Narodism is the ideology of Russia's peasant democrats. That is why every class-conscious worker should carefully watch the changes this ideology is undergoing. Section 1. Narodism is very old. It is considered to have been founded by Herzen and Chernyshevsky. Effective Narodism reached its peak when, in the 1870s, revolutionaries began to, quote, go among the people, the peasantry. The Narodnik's economic theory was developed in its more integral form by V.V. Vorontsov and Nikolai On, pseudonym of N.F. Danielson, an ideologist of the liberal Narodism of the 1880s and 1890s. In the 80s of the last century. Comment, this is the same time you see the height of populism in the United States. It's an agrarian, not really proletarian at all philosophy, and the further forward you go in time, it becomes explicitly anti-socialist, anti-proletarian. Continuing. In the early 20th century, the views of the left Narodniks were expressed in the most definite form by the socialist revolutionaries. The revolution of 1905, which showed all the social forces of Russia in an open mass action of the classes, made a general test of Narodism and defined its place. The only real content and social significance of Narodism is peasant democracy. The Russian liberal bourgeoisie is compelled, by virtue of its economic position, to strive not for the abolition, but for the division of the privileges of Purishkevich and company between the feudal landlords and the capitalists. On the other hand, the bourgeois democrats in Russia, the peasants, are compelled to strive for the abolition of all these privileges. For the Narodniks, phrases about socialism, socialization of the land, equalized tenure, and so on, are mere words covering up the fact that the peasants are striving for complete equality in politics and for the complete abolition of feudal land ownership. The revolution of 1905 finally revealed this social essence of Narodism, this class nature of it. The movement of the masses, in the form of the peasant unions of 1905, the local peasant struggles in 1905 and 1906, and the elections to the first two Dumas, the formation of Trudovik groups. All these great social facts, which showed us millions of peasants in action, swept aside Narodnik, professedly socialist, phrasemongering, like so much dust, and revealed the core, a peasant, bourgeois, democratic movement with an immense, still unexhausted store of energy. Those whom the experience of the greatest epoch in new, modern Russia has not taught to distinguish between the real content of Narodism and its verbal trappings are hopeless and cannot be taken seriously. They may be writers playing with words like AVP of Russkoye Bogatstvo, but they're not politicians. In our next article, we shall look more closely at the disintegration of Narodism and at that writer. Section 2. The experience of 1905 is vastly important. Comment, this was the first Russian Revolution when the bourgeoisie did not quite overthrow the Tsar, but was able to extract, along with the other classes, various reforms from the Russian Tsar. The experience of 1905 is vastly important precisely because it compelled the testing of Narodnik theories by the movement of the masses. And that test at once brought about the decay of Narodism and the collapse of Narodnik theories. At the very first Congress of the Socialist Revolutionaries in December 1905, the popular socialists began to break away from them, and they had seceded completely by the autumn of 1906. Those popular socialists forestalled our liquidators. They chanted in exactly the same way about a, quote, open party, and in the same way they abolished the slogans of consistent democracy and made renegade speeches. See, for example, Mr. Peshekhinov's articles in Russkoye Bogatstvo, number 8, 1906. Those were peasant cadets. Cadets were the bourgeois party. And the Second Duma, the Russian Congress, which was won during that period of reforms in 1905, which was not boycotted by the Narodniks, nor even by the socialist revolutionaries, proved that the majority of the peasant deputies followed the opportunists of Russkoye Bogatstvo, with the minority following the socialist revolutionaries. The Second Duma finally confirmed what was evident already from the Narodnik newspapers of the quote, Days of Freedom, autumn 1905 and spring 1906. Namely, that the socialist revolutionaries could be nothing but the left wing of Russia's peasant democrats, and that outside it, they were nothing. The disintegration of Narodism is bearing this out more and more clearly. While the counter-revolution was rampant, this disintegration progressed rapidly. The left Narodniks, quote, recalled themselves from the ranks of the Duma Trudoviks. Comment, the Trudoviks were another manifestation and grouping of this populist trajectory. The old party was virtually liquidated, but no new one was founded. Renegacy, which went as far as Ropshin's disgraceful writings, The Pale Horse and That Which Was Not, obtained a wide path for itself, even to the left Narodniks. Some of them, the Pochin group, are abandoning the boycott. Others gravitate towards Marxism, and Sukhanov, for example, although he is still exceedingly muddled. Still others gravitate towards anarchism. All in all, the breakup is far greater than among the Social Democrats, for while there are official centers, there is no clear, consistent, principled line capable of combating decadence. And now, Mr. AVP presents us with an example of this ideological decadence. Once, the Narodniks had a theory of their own. What is left now is nothing but, quote, reservations about Marxism picked up at random. Any unprincipled feuilleton writer for a glib bourgeois sheet could subscribe to Mr. AVP's article in defense of, quote, popular socialism without risking anything, without committing himself in any way, and without professing anything. For, quote, popular socialism is a meaningless phrase serving to evade the question of which class or social stratum is fighting for socialism throughout the world. It suffices to quote two specimens of Mr. AVP's twaddle. Quote, it appears, he wrote, that the party which has made the doctrine of proletarian socialism its own is in reality prepared to develop its forces also at the expense of other semi-proletarian or even bourgeois strata, unquote. An objection fit for a fourth-year schoolboy, isn't it? Both semi-proletarians and bourgeois are to be found in the socialist parties of the whole world. So what follows? It follows, Mr. AVP concludes, that one may sidestep the fact that only the proletariat all over the world, one, wages a sustained struggle against the capitalist class, and two, provides a mass support for the social democratic or Marxist parties. Another example, quote, take the students, wrote the glib Mr. AVP. Why, they're the most genuine bourgeoisie, and yet the socialists among them, I cannot say how it is now, until recently were almost a minority, unquote. Now, isn't that inimitable? Isn't that an argument worthy of a naive socialist revolutionary schoolchild? He does not notice, after 1905 to 07, how tens of millions of peasants and millions of workers took sides in the arena of all political actions, while attaching importance, as if it were an argument against, quote, proletarian socialism, to the fact that the liberal and democratic student youth in Russia sympathizes with the socialist revolutionaries and social democrats. Look here, Mr. AVP, have a sense of proportion. Class-conscious workers must follow a straightforward and clear policy with regard to the Narodniks. They must ruthlessly ridicule would-be socialist phrases and not allow the only serious question, that of consistent democracy, to be hidden behind them. Quote, popular socialism, equalized tenure, socialization of the land, cooperation, the labor principle, all that is not even worth refuting. Experience and the revolution have long since swept it altogether out of the sphere of serious political issues. You are merely hiding the serious question, that of democracy, behind that sort of twaddle. You must say clearly and plainly whether you are loyal to the slogans of consistent democracy. Are you willing and able to transform these slogans into regular work among the masses of a clearly specified social stratum? If so, the worker Democrat will be your ally and friend against all enemies of democracy. If not, go away. You're just a twaddler. So that's the end of the audiobook. Again, some reinforcement for what we started yesterday. If you haven't listened to that first file, make sure to go check it out. I'll put a link in a pinned comment below. I mean, really, it's time for everyone who considers themselves socialist or communist to reject this rebranding of right-wing politics. I mean, there was another Twitter space the following day where I dropped in on a conversation promoting some kind of turf feminism and opposing abortion as, quote, not a hill to die on. Excuse me, it's a basic human right. Also, currently in the United States, 60% of the population supports abortion in most or all cases, and then even more people in some cases. So opposing abortion rights, or a quote pro-choice political position, as far as that being a hill to die on, amazing. First of all, it's not a hill anybody's dying on. The majority of the population supports it. It's also a human right that socialists should be fighting for. It's a working class issue. Yet one more example of this sort of alt-right infiltration into the socialist movement, disruption. It needs to be rejected en masse, and I hope to see not just commenters, but other content creators stepping up the rhetoric against this. It's really dragged on for too long. It's not novel anymore. It's not cute. It's amusing. I mean, it never was. But really, the novelty has worn off. It's time to just knock this shit out. On that note, let's get to it. What do you think? Leave a question or comment below. We'll continue the discussion there. Otherwise, thanks for listening, and thanks to the current patrons. We don't run ads on this channel, so the Patreon basically is the support. It's very important, and we appreciate all of it. Every contribution is encouraging as well as materially helpful, so thanks to everyone who has contributed. It's enabled me to spend a lot more time on this channel, and has enabled me to produce a lot more videos than I would have been able to do otherwise. So patreon.com/socialismforall if you too would like to get your name on the screen alongside the other patrons. Beyond that, once the content has been produced and uploaded, that's where engagement comes in. Liking, sharing, subscribing, commenting, even if it's just thanks or good video. All of that helps to boost the uploaded content, helps more people to be able to stumble across this content more easily. That's what it's all about, making this content accessible and helping to spread conversations about opposing capitalism and organizing to build socialism. Speaking of, online education can be really key as far as, getting the audiobooks and getting involved in some discussions, but in the end, you got to get organized in your community. Agitate, educate, and organize. Look around for what's available for you to join, and remember that socialist political parties are just one form of organization. There's unions, there is things like Food Not Bombs that helps to feed people. There's all kinds of stuff, mass organizing beyond just sort of vanguard organizing. Both are important, but as far as the numbers go, mass organizing involves way more people. Don't forget about that. We're going to leave it there for now. Thanks again for listening, and we will catch you in the next video. Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. This file is being recorded for the February 2022 edition of Socialism for All, and it's an audiobook and discussion of Critical Remarks on the National Question by Lenin from 1913. If you like this video, please click like and subscribe, and consider supporting on Patreon at patreon.com/socialismforall. There's a link to Patreon in the video description. So this text was written in October to December 1913. It was published in 1913 in the journal Prozveshchenia, numbers 10, 11, and 12. It was signed V. Ilian and published according to the journal text. The source is Lenin Collected Works, Progress Publishers, 1972, Moscow, Volume 20. It was translated by Bernard Isaacs and the late Joe Feinberg. HTML transcription and markup by R. Cimbala, and it's in the public domain at the Marxists Internet Archive, marxists.org. Thanks as usual to the Marxists Internet Archive for hosting this and thousands of other free Marxist texts. Please go check them out and support them and/or volunteer for them if you can. So this text has 6 chapters. The first chapter is Liberals and Democrats on the Language Question. 2 is National Culture. 3 is Nationalist Bogey of Assimilation. 4 is Cultural National Autonomy. 5 is The Equality of Nations and the Rights of National Minorities. And 6 is Centralization and Autonomy. As usual with any of the longer texts, if anyone out there listening would like to make note of the timestamps of each section and then put them in a comment, I will put them into the video description, which then breaks the video up on YouTube. So thanks in advance for anyone contributing to that. This text, before we get into chapter 1, begins with a publisher's note. It says, the article, Critical Remarks on the National Question, was written by Lenin in October to December 1913 and published the same year in the Bolshevik legal journal, Prozveshchenia, numbers 10, 11, and 12. The article was preceded by lectures on the national question, which Lenin delivered in a number of Swiss cities, Zurich, Geneva, Lausanne, and Bern, in the summer of 1913. In the autumn of 1913, Lenin made a report on the national question at the summer conference of the Central Committee of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party with party workers. A resolution on the report drafted by Lenin was adopted. After the conference, Lenin started work on his article, Critical Remarks on the National Question. So we're going to start that work now. Let's get into the text. It is obvious that the national question has now become prominent among the problems of Russian public life. The aggressive nationalism of the reactionaries, the transition of counter-revolutionary bourgeois liberalism to nationalism, particularly Great Russian, but also Polish, Jewish, Ukrainian, etc. And lastly, the increase of nationalist vacillations among the different, quote, national, i.e. non-Great Russian, Social Democrats, who have gone to the length of violating the party program. All these make it incumbent on us to give more attention to the national question than we have done so far. This article pursues a special object, namely, to examine in their general bearing precisely these program vacillations of Marxists and would-be Marxists on the national question. In Severnaya Pravda number 29, for September 5, 1913, Liberals and Democrats on the language question, I had occasion to speak of the opportunism of the liberals on the national question. This article of mine was attacked by the opportunist Jewish newspaper Zeit, Time, in an article by Mr. F. Liebman. From the other side, the program of the Russian Marxists on the national question has been criticized by the Ukrainian opportunist Mr. Lev Yurkevich in Jvin, 1913, numbers 7 through 8. Both these writers touched on so many questions that to reply to them, we're obliged to deal with the most diverse aspects of the subject. I think that the most convenient thing would be to start with a reprint of the article from Severnaya Pravda. So commenting, we're about to read that article which Lenin had published just so that everybody can understand what they were talking about. However, first there are 3 footnotes. So the first is Severnaya Pravda, or Northern Truth, was one of the names of the newspaper Pravda. Pravda, a legal Bolshevik daily published in St. Petersburg. It was founded on the initiative of the St. Petersburg workers in April 1912. Pravda was a popular working-class newspaper, published with money collected by the workers themselves. A wide circle of worker correspondents and worker publicists formed around the newspaper. Over 11,000 correspondence items from workers were published in a single year. Pravda had an average circulation of 40,000, some issues running into 60,000 copies. Lenin directed Pravda from abroad where he was living. He wrote for the paper almost daily, gave instructions to the editorial board, and rallied the party's best literary forces around the newspaper. Pravda was subjected to constant police persecution. During the first year of its existence, it was confiscated 41 times, and 36 legal actions were brought against its editors, who served prison sentences totaling 47 and a half months. In the course of 2 years and 3 months, Pravda was closed down 8 times by the Tsarist government, but reissued under new names: Robochaya Pravda, Severnaya Pravda, Pravda Truda, Za Pravdu, Proletarskaya Pravda, Put Pravdi, Robochi, and Trudovaya Pravda. On July 8, 1914, on the eve of the First World War, the paper was closed down. Publication was not resumed until after the February Revolution. Beginning from March 5, 1917, Pravda appeared as the central organ of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party. Lenin joined the editorial board on April 5 on his return from abroad, and he took over the paper's management. In July to October 1917, Pravda changed its name frequently, owing to persecution by the provisional government, appearing successively as Listok Pravdi, Proletari, Robochi, and Robochi Put. On October 27, the newspaper began to appear under its old name, Pravda. So the next note is on Zeit, or Time, a weekly organ of the Bund, published in Yiddish in St. Petersburg from December 20, 1912 to May 5, 1914. Jvin, or the Bell, was a monthly legal nationalist journal of Menshevik trend, published in the Ukrainian language in Kiev from January 1913 to the middle of 1914. And Mensheviks, as opposed to the Bolsheviks became what we would think of as communists today. The Mensheviks became what we would think of as social democrats today, sort of more reformist, more of a reformed welfare capitalist type of approach. So now we're going to go back to the main text, and this is the section where Lenin reprints his article, Liberals and Democrats on the Language Question. Here we go. On several occasions, the newspapers have mentioned the report of the governor of the Caucasus, a report that is noteworthy, not for its Black Hundred spirit, but for its timid, quote, liberalism. So, another footnote here, the Black Hundreds were monarchist gangs formed by the Tsarist police to fight the revolutionary movement. They murdered revolutionaries, assaulted progressive intellectuals, and organized pogroms. So, who can we draw some parallel to today? Well, these are reactionary gangs, like the most, at that time, monarchists. Reactionary gangs formed by the police to fight the revolutionary movement. We could say things like the Proud Boys or other reactionary right-wing vigilante gangs. You know, ask yourself who today would be interested in murdering revolutionaries, assaulting progressive intellectuals, and organizing pogroms? Well, look at your alt-right various, street fighting groups, and there you go. Anyway, picking up with Lenin. So this report is noteworthy not for its Black Hundred spirit, but for its timid, quote, liberalism. Among other things, the governor of the Caucasus objects to artificial Russification of non-Russian nationalities. Representatives of non-Russian nationalities in the Caucasus are themselves striving to teach their children Russian. An example of this is the Armenian church schools, in which the teaching of Russian is not obligatory. Russkoye Slovo, number 198, one of the most widely circulating liberal newspapers in Russia, points to this fact and draws the correct conclusion that the hostility towards the Russian language in Russia, quote, stems exclusively from the artificial, when it adds it should have said forced, implanting of that language, the Russian language. There's a footnote there. Russkoye Slovo, or the Russian Word, was a daily published in Moscow from 1895. The first trial issue appeared in 1894 to July 1918. Formally non-party, the paper defended the interests of the Russian bourgeoisie from a moderate liberal platform. News was given a wide coverage in the paper, which was the first in Russia to send special correspondents to all the large cities at home and to many foreign capitals. Okay, I think we have a little break from footnotes for a minute, so back to the main text. Quote, there is no reason to worry about the fate of the Russian language. It will itself win recognition throughout Russia, says the newspaper. End of quote. This is perfectly true because the requirements of economic exchange will always compel the nationalities living in one state, as long as they wish to live together, to study the language of the majority. The more democratic the political system in Russia becomes, the more powerfully, rapidly, and extensively capitalism will develop. The more urgently will the requirements of economic exchange impel various nationalities to study the language most convenient for general commercial relations. The liberal newspaper, however, hastens to slap itself in the face and demonstrate its liberal inconsistency. Quote, even those who oppose Russification, it says, would hardly be likely to deny that in a country as huge as Russia, there must be one single official language, and that this language can be only Russian, unquote. Logic turned inside out, tiny Switzerland has not lost anything, but has gained from having not one single official language, but three, German, French, and Italian. In Switzerland, 70% of the population are Germans. In Russia, 43% are Great Russians. 22% French. In Russia, 17% are Ukrainians. And 7% Italians. In Russia, 6% are Poles and 4.5% Belarusians. If Italians in Switzerland often speak French in their common parliament, they do not do so because they are menaced by some savage police law. There are none such in Switzerland. But because the civilized citizens of a democratic state themselves prefer a language that is understood by a majority. The French language does not instill hatred in Italians because it is the language of a free civilized nation, a language that is not imposed by disgusting police measures. Why should, quote, huge Russia, much more varied and terribly backward country, inhibit her development by the retention of any kind of privilege for any one language? Should not the contrary be true? liberal gentlemen. Should not Russia, if she wants to overtake Europe, put an end to every kind of privilege as quickly as possible, as completely as possible, and as vigorously as possible? If all privileges disappear, if the imposition of any one language ceases, all Slavs will easily and rapidly learn to understand each other and will not be frightened by the, quote, horrible thought that speeches in different languages will be heard in the common parliament. The requirements of economic exchange will themselves decide which language of the given country it is, to the advantage of the majority to know, in the interests of commercial relations. This decision will be all the firmer because it is adopted voluntarily by a population of various nationalities, and its adoption will be the more rapid and extensive, the more consistent the democracy, and, as a consequence of it, the more rapid the development of capitalism. The liberals approach the language question in the same way as they approach all political questions, like hypocritical hucksters, holding out one hand openly to democracy, and the other behind their backs to the feudalists and police. Well put. We are against privileges, shout the liberals, and under cover, they haggle with the feudalists for first one and then another privilege. Such is the nature of all liberal bourgeois nationalism. Not only Great Russian, it is the worst of them all because of its violent character and its kinship with the Purishkeviches. Footnote there, V.M. Purishkevich lived from 1870 to 1920, was a big landlord and rabid reactionary, a Black Hundred monarchist. Continuing. But Polish, Jewish, Ukrainian, Georgian, and every other nationalism. Under the slogan of, quote, national culture, the bourgeoisie of all nations, both in Austria and in Russia, are in fact pursuing the policy of splitting the workers, emasculating democracy, and haggling with the feudalists over the sale of the people's rights and the people's liberty. The slogan of working class democracy is not national culture, but the international culture of democracy and the worldwide working class movement. Let the bourgeoisie deceive the people with various positive national programs. The class-conscious worker will answer the bourgeoisie. There is only one solution to the national problem, insofar as it can, in general, be solved in the capitalist world. That is the world of profit, squabbling, and exploitation. And that solution is consistent democracy. The proof, Switzerland in Western Europe, a country with an old culture, and Finland in Eastern Europe, a country with a young culture. The national program of working class democracy is absolutely no privileges for any one nation or any one language. The solution of the problem of the political self-determination of nations, that is, their separation as states by completely free democratic methods, the promulgation of a law for the whole state by virtue of which any measure, rural, urban, or communal, etc., introducing any privilege of any kind for one of the nations and militating against the equality of nations or the rights of a national minority shall be declared illegal and ineffective, and any citizen of the state shall have the right to demand that such a measure be annulled as unconstitutional, and that those who attempt to put it into effect be punished. Working class democracy contraposes to the nationalist wrangling of the various bourgeois parties over questions of language, etc., the demand for the unconditional unity and complete amalgamation of workers of all nationalities in all working class organizations, trade union, cooperative, consumers, educational, and all others, in contradistinction to any kind of bourgeois nationalism. Only this type of unity and amalgamation can uphold democracy and defend the interests of the workers against capital, which is already international and is becoming more so, and promote the development of mankind towards a new way of life that is alien to all privileges and all exploitation. And that's the end of chapter 1. Now moving on to chapter 2, national culture. As the reader will see, the article in Severnaya Pravda made use of a particular example, i.e. the problem of the official language, to illustrate the inconsistency and opportunism of the liberal bourgeoisie, which, in the national question, extends a hand to the feudalists and the police. Everybody will understand that, apart from the problem of an official language, the liberal bourgeoisie behaves just as treacherously, hypocritically, and stupidly, even from the standpoint of the interests of liberalism, in a number of other related issues. The conclusion to be drawn from this It is that all liberal bourgeois nationalism sows the greatest corruption among the workers and does immense harm to the cause of freedom and the proletarian class struggle. This bourgeois and bourgeois feudalist tendency is all the more dangerous for its being concealed behind the slogan of national culture. It is under the guise of national culture, Great Russian, Polish, Jewish, Ukrainian, and so forth, that the Black Hundreds and the clericals, and also the bourgeoisie of all nations, are doing their dirty and reactionary work. So just a quick comment here. The situation that Lenin was writing about in Russia at this time, 1913, is there was a growing movement against Tsarism. There had been the revolution of 1905, which forced some reforms to the Tsarist system, and you had a bourgeoisie, a capitalist class that was emerging, but there still had not been a formal overthrow of the feudal Tsarist system at this point. So although the bourgeoisie was wealthy, propertied, and controlled the capitalism that existed at that time, they were relative to the prevailing feudal Tsarism, a progressive force. They were sort of resistance fighters, if you will, against Tsarism. However, not nearly to the extent that the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party was, and particularly the Bolsheviks. So, in other words, at this point in 1913, we're still several years out from the overthrow of the Tsar, and the bourgeoisie, after the overthrow of the Tsar, was planning, along with their Menshevikan social revolutionary henchmen, basically, who sided with the bourgeoisie in that situation, against the Bolsheviks. They were planning on just setting up a bourgeois capitalist republic in Russia. Of course, the Bolsheviks outmaneuvered them in 1917, and they quickly had a socialist revolution right after the bourgeois one. So when Lenin calls the bourgeoisie opportunist, normally we're talking about opportunism from the point of view of socialists working with people with a diametrically opposed, fundamentally different class interest. That would be proletarians working with the bourgeoisie. That's a right-wing error. You don't want to make that. But for the bourgeoisie, their opportunism is working with the feudalists. That is their right-wing error, if you will. Just remember that all these things are relative to the state of historical development and so forth. So anyway, continuing with the text. Such are the facts of the national life of today, if viewed from the Marxist angle, i.e. from the standpoint of the class struggle, and if the slogans are compared with the interests and policies of classes, not with meaningless general principles, declamations, and phrases. The slogan of national culture is a bourgeois, and often also a Black Hundred and clerical, i.e. monarchist and deeply reactionary, fraud. Our slogan is the international culture of democracy and of the world working class movement. Here the Bundist, Mr. Liebman, rushes into the fray and annihilates me with the following deadly tirade. And before we get to that quote, there's a footnote here on the Bund. The Bund, or the General Jewish Workers' Union of Lithuania, Poland, and Russia, came into being in 1897 at the inaugural Congress of Jewish Social Democratic Groups in Vilna. And again, another footnote, when they say social democratic prior to 1917, this was the general term for Marxism. It consisted mainly of semi-proletarian Jewish artisans of Western Russia. At the first Congress of the RSDLP, Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, in 1898, the Bund joined the latter, quote, as an autonomous organization, independent only in respect of questions affecting the Jewish proletariat specifically, unquote. The Bund was a vehicle of nationalist and separatist ideas in Russia's working class movement. In April 1901, the Bund's Fourth Congress resolved to alter the organizational ties with the RSDLP as established by the latter's First Congress. In its resolution, the Bund Congress declared that it regarded the RSDLP as a federation of national organizations, of which the Bund was a federal member. Following the rejection by the Second Congress of the RSDLP of the Bund's demand for recognition as the sole representative of the Jewish proletariat, the Bund left the party, but rejoined it in 1906 on the basis of a decision of the Fourth Unity Congress. Within the RSDLP, the Bund constantly supported the party's opportunist wing, the economists, Mensheviks, and liquidators, and waged a struggle against the Bolsheviks and Bolshevism. To the Bolsheviks' programmatic demand for the right of nations to self-determination, the Bund contraposed the demand for autonomy of the national culture. During the years of the Stolypin reaction and the new revolutionary upsurge, the Bund adopted a liquidationist stand and played an active part in the formation of the August anti-party bloc. During the First World War, 1914 to 18, the Bundists took a social chauvinist stand. In 1917, the Bund supported the bourgeois provisional government, and that was what I was saying before. After the overthrow of the Tsar in February 1917, the bourgeoisie started setting up this provisional government, and the Mensheviks and others, not the Bolsheviks, sided with the enemies of the Great October Socialist Revolution. During the foreign military intervention and the Civil War which followed, the Bundist leaders made common cause with the forces of counter-revolution. At the same time, a tendency toward cooperation with the Soviets became apparent among the Bund rank-and-file members. In March 1921, the Bund dissolved itself, part of the membership joining the Russian Communist Party, Bolsheviks, in accordance with the general rules of admission. So now on to Mr. Liebman's quote, anyone in the least familiar with the national question knows that international culture is not non-national culture, culture without a national form. Non-national culture, which must not be Russian, Jewish, or Polish, but only pure culture, is nonsense. International ideas can appeal to the working class only when they are adapted to the language spoken by the worker and to the concrete national conditions under which they live. The workers should not be indifferent to the condition and development of their national culture because it is through it, and only through it, that they are able to participate in the, quote, international culture of democracy and of the world working class movement. This is well known, but V.I. Lenin turns a deaf ear to it all, unquote. Ponder over this typically Bundist argument, designed, if you please, to demolish the Marxist thesis that I have advanced. With the air of supreme self-confidence of one who is, quote, familiar with the national question, this Bundist passes off ordinary bourgeois views as, quote, well-known axioms. It is true, my dear Bundist, that international culture is not non-national. Nobody said that it was. Nobody has proclaimed a pure culture, either Polish, Jewish, or Russian, etc. And your jumble of empty words is simply an attempt to distract the reader's attention and to obscure the issue with tinkling words. The elements of democratic and socialist culture are present, if only in rudimentary form, in every national culture, since in every nation there are toiling and exploited masses whose conditions of life inevitably give rise to the ideology of democracy and socialism. But every nation also possesses a bourgeois culture, and most nations a reactionary and clerical culture as well, in the form not merely of elements, but of the dominant culture. Therefore, the general national culture is the culture of the landlords, the clergy, and the bourgeoisie. This fundamental and, for a Marxist, elementary truth was kept in the background by the Bundist, who drowned it in his jumble of words, i.e., instead of revealing and clarifying the class gulf to the reader, he in fact obscured it. In fact, the Bundist acted like a bourgeois, whose every interest requires the spreading of a belief in a non-class national culture. In advancing the slogan of the international culture of democracy and of the world working class movement, we take from each national culture only its democratic and socialist elements. We take them only and absolutely in opposition to the bourgeois culture and the bourgeois nationalism of each nation. No Democrat, and certainly no Marxist, denies that all languages should have equal status, or that it is necessary to engage in polemics with one's native bourgeoisie in one's native language, and to advocate anti-clerical or anti-bourgeois ideas among one's, quote, native peasantry and petty bourgeoisie. That goes without saying, but the Bundist uses these indisputable truths to obscure the point in dispute, i.e. the real issue. The question is whether it is permissible for a Marxist, directly or indirectly, to advance the slogan of national culture, or whether he should oppose it by advocating in all languages the slogan of workers' internationalism while, quote, adapting himself to all local and national features. The significance of the national culture slogan is not determined by some petty intellectual's promise or good intention to, quote, interpret it as, quote, meaning the development through it of an international culture. It would be puerile subjectivism to look at it in that way. The significance of the slogan of national culture is determined by the objective alignment of all classes in a given country and in all countries of the world. The national culture of the bourgeoisie is a fact. I repeat, bourgeoisie everywhere enters into the most quickly landed proprietors and clergy. Progressive bourgeois.
Okay, so that's all for now. I just finished my daily routine of meditation, yoga, martial arts, along with some reading before I started that. I encourage you to try out the whole routine, rewind if you're just joining us, and please like, share, and subscribe. My name's Dan Baker. This is Comrade Meow's Audiobooks, and I'm a combat veteran of the YPG International. Join the revolutionary